Mr. Flores, a complete delight. The one and only. Oh my goodness, how have you been, Flores? You've been doing all right?
Daniel, how are you? Can you hear me?
I can hear you wonderfully. My goodness, what a treat. How's life
I
treating you? How are
know
you doing?
I'm
I've
doing
been
really
working a
well.
lot heavily
with Seminar 16 of Lacan. I started my own solo channel alongside the Vanishing Mediator project that I do with Nick and Max. But this one's focusing more on my own stuff. So it's still psychoanalysis and Marxist theory, and I hope to do a Hegel project soon
Wow.
as well. But right now I'm doing a work on Seminar 16, which I actually started writing some thoughts on, which will be a paper of mine called Structure is the Real on the Topology of the Other.
Wow.
Because I like this seminar specifically due to the fact that, well, one, it takes place around the aftermath of May 68, the failed revolution in Paris.
Right.
And it's paradoxically both a repetition of what Lacan has been talking about since the 1950s, but also a radical break, a novelty in his thinking, because he focuses on what, like I said earlier, structure is the real, it's not symbolic. And he uses mathematical logic. So he wants to marry back not only logic, but mathematical logic, or mathematics into mathematical logic. Um, and he sees that with set theory. So he likens his logic of the signifier to the Russell set or the Russell's paradox. And
Interesting.
he wants to get at what is, I think Alenka uses this term, but impassive formalization.
Hmm.
And so how the impasse at the side of formalization is how we get at the notion of the signifier, which
Hmm.
would represent the subject to another signifier. So his definition of the signifier is quite radically different from the Saussurian notion of the sign, which includes the signifier and the signified. Because the signified is deprivileged because of the relationship of meaning and the signifier has a more you could say anarchic position because of its privilege, because of the fact that it's not representing meaning, but rather the subject, right? And
Hmm.
so again, that maxim or that axiom is the signifier represents the subject to another signifier, and so the subject is always absent in the discourse. So that's why it needs a subject or it needs a signifier to represent itself, and the signifier uh, is it gets its meaning not from itself, but because of an embedded differential network. So it
Hmm.
needs another signifier to relay its own meaning while
Hmm.
representing the subject. So in the definition, you already have a Russell's paradox because the signifier is supposed to represent the subject, right? And so it makes a choice. Does it represent the subject? Okay, then how does it become a signifier if it needs another signifier for its meaning? So then it needs another signifier. So you have the problem of the closed set and the open set because these other signifier is a battery bank of signifiers. So this battery bank of signifiers represents the locus of the other, the big other. So due to this paradox, we encounter the fact of the famous saying, "There is no big other," or "There is no other for the other." So why this is important is because this is the manifestation of what is called primal repression in the child in ontogenesis in the Freudian sense. The traumatic encounter of the gap and inconsistency of the other, which, in order to avoid the traumatic encounter of this manifestation of the Russell's paradox in real life, we undergo the castration experience. Thus, we get the famous S1 or master signifier that would mark and stamp the traumatic encounter. We
Hmm.
thus enter into the symbolic, right?
Hmm.
And repress that encounter. So that's like one of the sort of fundamental things that is going on in Seminar 16, and also the crisis of knowledge in the university because he um, he talks about this thing called the absolutization of the market, in which capitalism and science as a knowledge production intertwine, and therefore are able to create a knowledge market which forecloses truth.
Hmm.
And so psychoanalysis is important as a discourse is because it revitalizes the notion of truth or truth effects, if you want to use Badiou, because Badiou will take an influence off of the point of truth, not as like a big capital T thing, but more of an effect or an operation
Hmm.
from a discourse.
Well, that is magnificent, and I appreciate you sharing all that and fascinating. And Christian, Mr. Jonkin, it is wonderful to see you. I think that that idea of, I like versus Russell, and so it just makes me think of what I like to talk about is the Gödel point, which is the
Mhm.
point where this, and obviously he's in response to Russell and all of these different people and different things, and Frege more particularly. But what I think you see, like for me, the Gödel point is the point where you precisely see that you have to make a choice between correspondence or coherence. Like where you have sort of a system of internally consistency, which arrives obviously what Gödel is saying is not that there is no such thing as truth, is that the consistency of a system does not necessarily mean it corresponds. But in order to tell that it corresponds, you have to get rid of consistency. Because to make something of you could almost say, the kind or dimensionality where it determines correspondence, it has to be taken out of I talk about internally consistent systems, which you could say you have to open the set. Well, if you open the set, it can't be axiomatic. But yet it could be true. This is the key. Correspondence does not equal coherence, and yet by what other standard do you judge correspondence than if the system coheres? And yet, if it coheres, that could simply be a product of all of the premises that are arranged in such a way to create that effect, but actually lose correspondence. Wonderful examples that I think are psychoanalytically relevant. I like to think all the time of things like conspiracies, which are not irrational, they're incredibly rational. The premises all add up. There's a logic that goes together, or if you believe that someone's out to, if you believe something really bad will happen if you don't do X, then you probably see a lot of evidence that you need to do X so that bad thing doesn't occur, right? Like it all kind of coheres, and yet it nevertheless may not be true. And yet here's the critical point. The only way to tell if it corresponds at that point would be taking the risk, right? Taking the risk of confronting, well, let me actually then not do X and see if the bad thing occurs. Oh, by the way, then if the bad thing occurs, the bad thing occurs, right? It's kind of too late at that point, right? And so there's a certain risk that has to be taken at the Gödel point, which I think you can associate with the real here. Like the real emerges out of the encounter of the Gödel point, which then the subject, I think it's a very good point you're making, and Mr. Rivera, good to see you. We have the wonderful Flores has joined us today, so I loved when you and Javier had that discussion. And the subject, I think it is wise to suggest the subject often emerges precisely as a certain response to the Gödel point, where it's either trying to, like that you actually define your subjectivity in how you tarry with or relate to the Gödel point, and then the symbolic that you form could be the signal that you send to other subjects, other people, on how you relate to the Gödel point, which also then gives them permission on how they do it and how they should do it. And we then also all form a certain system of relation relative to that Gödel point that we then define as the right way or the wrong way, and that actually can use to avoid the trauma of encountering that point. And then it gets further embedded, further covered, further covered, further covered, on and on and on.
Absolutely.
And so that Gödel point, as which I think is very interesting, because then what for me it's doing, and I think you're pointing at this with what you were saying on seminar 16, because I just like to talk about the truism, the rational, and kind of epistemology. What this problem is part of thought itself. This is the
Mhm.
key. Like the structure of thought itself cannot make coherence equal correspondence, but to accept that threatens all of thought. Like if thought doesn't necessarily correspond when it coheres, then what is it exactly? What is it doing? By what authority can it compel action, or by what authority could you erect a society on it, right? So you have this
Mhm.
problem that you have to deal with. You could also link it up with the map isn't the territory problem. The second book in the True Isn't the Rational is called The Map is Indestructible, which is the problem of internally consistent systems, which what you're trying to do is create a map that in its coherency gives you no reason to think it isn't the territory. But of course,
Mhm.
this means there's some delicate balancing acts, and then I'll give it to you on any thoughts on anything at all, and anyone is if a map equals the territory, it is unusable because it is one to one and it would overwhelm you with its complexity. But if you don't genuinely believe that the map is enough like the territory, then you cannot use it, right? So there has to be some way that you arrange your life relative to your map, that it is always plausible to you, that when someone says, well, it's not, your worldview isn't the world, right? Yeah, of course I know. But practically, you have to live as if that's not true, right? Even though when someone asks you, you know that's true, but you practically have to live that's not true. Well, what are the mental gymnastics or psychological mechanisms one has to employ on themselves in order to maintain that plausibility that this map is enough like the territory that it practically is the territory, even if it technically is not the territory?
Right.
Well, whatever structure you create, it is going to be very important that nowhere within it can you encounter a point that would reveal to you and force you to acknowledge that it isn't the territory. You must make sure that does not occur. And you also must organize your social and your relationships to make sure that they can't have you stumble upon that. And also the way you relate to them may not be in such a manner that makes them stumble upon that remembrance, because that would threaten to make them have to restructure the entire map, possibly from the ground up, or they can just kill you, of course, or you can just other them, whatever is going to work. And that particular traumatic possibility is precisely what then generates both the way the subject positions itself to the other and how the symbolic actually forms. So I think I'm very interested by this idea of locating, and then feel free to say anything, structure in the real, because I don't think like the structure of thought itself entails this problem. This is not a problem that and of course if it's thought, it's libido, because it's all, there's no division between emotion, all these different things. This is part of the problem of structure, you could almost say, itself, that we have to navigate. And it is not simply one that can be covered. It is not one that can be entirely dispelled, and yet you're going to be doing everything in your possible to keep it away from you in certain manners so that it does not occur. So what you were saying just makes me think of what I like to talk about with the Gödel point, but I'd be curious on any thoughts.
Oh, absolutely. And I love that you brought up Gödel, because Gödel is somebody besides Russell, Frege, Cantor that, first of all, it's like when we talk about like Lacan, like we're so used to like thinking of like Zizek or like, his relation to like French theory and continental philosophy. Of course, he's definitely influenced by many thinkers within the continental tradition, but there's not enough dialogue on Lacan's interest in analytic philosophy and those thinkers that I just listed. I had an interview. I was interviewed by Raul. He has I don't know if you know who Raul.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, and on Lacan structure, mathematical logic, and the relationship to analytic philosophy. But yeah, this thing about the Gödel point, the sort of forced choice between correspondence or coherency, and the risk that you take in doing it. It's funny because to go back to seminar 16, the second section has to deal with Pascal and the wager, because why this is important again goes back to, well, the signifier for the other, the big other, would also be that which completes the other, and which would guarantee all certainty in the field of knowledge and truth. And we could go back to that the person who instantiates not only the guarantor of knowledge and certainty, but also the subject of science, which be Descartes. Descartes is not only the founder of modern philosophy and subjectivity, but also the subject of science. For Lacan, the subject of science is the subject that is interrogated in psychoanalysis, and the subject of science is split by its own discourse and is thus foreclosed and repressed by science, because science is in the business of the object of its inquiry, but in the process forecloses its subject. And so psychoanalysis for Freud, right, is always under the question of, can psychoanalysis be a science? But for Lacan, he problematizes the matter and asks, what would a science be like, which would include psychoanalysis? But to get back to the point about this risk, and I would like to even put the wager, which comes from Pascal, is because Pascal's God is ultimately real rather than the God of the philosophers, because the God of the philosophers is ultimately imaginary, and not just in the Lacanian sense of the imaginary symbolic real, but relies on sensibility and understanding or just on concepts which are generated within, like to be Kantian, the understanding, the intuition, and the sensibility. And so for philosophy, for Lacan, it can never get outside of that, and thus it seems to maintain itself against the real, right? And so this is his gripe with philosophy. I know Elaine Badu likes to call him an anti-philosopher. I don't agree with that, but his problems with philosophy is that it maintains a sort of mastery, which is its own impotence, right? Because it can never get out of its own internal contradiction. It's always stuck in its own internal deadlocks. It can never get outside of itself. This is why he likes science, and why, even though science forecloses truth, nonetheless tarries with the real. And this is why, for science, he says that science, including physics, enters this sort of pseudo mathematical formalism. But the point is that we never stay at the level of formalism. We always stay at the level of we always end up at the level of formalization of discourse, because it's one thing to write E equals MC squared, but as soon as I talk about it and formulate, discourse, write a whole philosophical treatise on the nature of mathematics, I've entered into formalization, and that's where, we enter into paradoxes or contradictions, because formalization, language, and speech fail to encapsulate and complete what I formalize. So that's the sort of thing that psychoanalysis is getting at as a discourse without speech. I'm speaking a little bit, like, a little too fast, but to go back to the wager and God, is that Pascal, it's interesting. Pascal, for Lacan, is different from the philosophers who want to prove God, because he doesn't care about God's existence. He cares about belief, right? He wants to test belief and an enjoyable life, and why it's better to have an enjoyable life by your belief than to not have it by not believing, right? And for Lacan, he situates the existence of God versus the inexistence of God, with the existence of the other versus the inexistence of the other, and that the wager evokes the subject in the act of wagering what you don't have and what you may have in the future. And that is jouissance, right? That is enjoyment. And jouissance is what structures civilization. As to go back to Freud's civilization discontent, society is structured by a loss, that in order to enter the symbolic society, you have to give up something. You have to give up your own sexual enjoyment, which is infantile. But also from that, the symbolic structure that you're interpolated or represented by, especially that signifier, is structured into a whole, right? He likes this idea of, and this goes to your point about, structure is the real, and interrogating that and talking about thought. He likes to use this thing of a bottle or like a mustard pot, which, no matter what, it is a whole, right? There is a whole at the very core of structure, and that's what makes it real. So a lot of it escapes. And he gives a sort of imagistic analogy with the myth of the Danaids, who are cursed for murdering their husbands, to fill up this pot with water, but there's a hole at the bottom, so they're endlessly trying to fill the structure, right? And that is what we're trying to do, not with like our lack and because we suffer, but even in discourse, even in philosophy and in sciences, we're trying to complete structure. And that is the sort of dilemma that we're dealing with. And with this wager, not only for knowledge and the proof of a good life, but psychoanalysis itself acts as a wager, because you wager your own loss of enjoyment and the belief to have something later through the analytic cure, which is quite interesting. Yeah.
I think all those comments are fantastic, and I'll give it to Mr. Jockin here. So first off, I like to think about whole with the W in parentheses, and that, there's something about the whole that the proper address is going to be some sort of whole with the W in parentheses whole. And the question simply becomes, is one's relation, if the structure of the subject and, perhaps reality has this certain continuation to it. As you fill it, it keeps falling out and you keep going. If one can learn to enjoy that process, if one can actually find intrinsic motivation in that, because I would argue that very structure is the possibility of intrinsic motivation, or, perhaps a higher drive. if one actually comes to be compelled properly, perhaps by beauty we talk about very often, or, the ability to have the certain childhood in the Nietzschean sense that is bringing with it the lion and the camel and different things, right? So this structure brings with it a possibility of intrinsic motivation, but only if one can go through, dare I say, the trauma of the realization that this is the structure. And there is something, and Aspasi, it's always a pleasure to have you. I enjoyed our talk about holograms. That was super cool with Bergson and everyone. And you see what's very interesting then is the very speech act, the tendency of philosophy. There is always this closing, this effort to have a certain completeness that ironically actually is a defense against accepting the whole. And every time I say that, I'm going to mean the W in parentheses sort of whole, which actually, if one could integrate with or come to accept, brings with it the possibility of intrinsic motivation. But the only way to get there is through a certain trauma. And I cannot help because I always like to think of Dante as psychoanalytical. And I think Dante is a movement from the algebraic to the geometrical, and it is actually a movement. Once Dante gets to the top, it is the beatific vision. The relation with beauty is some sort of wheel within a wheel continuation. And this moves from a certain toil. It's interesting that it moves from toil to ever deepening attraction, right? But it's the same structure. It's the whole with the W in parentheses. And I suppose the question is if you simply focus on the whole, H-O-L-E, or if you learn to see it as whole for the possibility of the ever intrinsic motivation, which also the experience of beauty, and we like to talk about the phenomenology of beauty, all sort of speaks to, I think, this. What I will also say too, what on this idea of not enclosing, accepting this, not giving into those temptations. And I think bringing in Pascal is very important. The first thing it makes me think of is what Owen in the Agon will say about Achilles, which is the idea that Achilles goes onto the battlefield with very little armor on. And actually, there is something lacking themos to go on the battlefield with a lot of armor. One goes into the battlefield vulnerable. If you don't go into a space vulnerable, there's actually a lack of courage in that, right? Sam, it is always a treat to see you. Goodness, it's a pleasure. And so what's very interesting is actually the temptations of enclosure are a lacking of themos and courage. And actually, there's a classical emphasis on the idea that armor is making up for a lack of skillfulness or a lack of being able to go with the flow, dare I say, of the battle. So the first thing is there's a certain return to the lessons of Achilles, as Owen talks about. And also, of course, Owen also talks about the story of Prometheus with his brother not giving humans any claws or fur or anything. And this nakedness turns out to be humanity's strength. It's why they, obviously Prometheus gives them the fire, but vulnerability turns into a strength, which is very interesting. But then if we structure the discourse to allow armor to form, that it's all just basically shutting us in something, of which is a response to the trauma of realizing, as I would put it, coherence isn't correspondence, and I don't like that. So how do I make it seem as if coherence equals correspondence, and then I don't have to face that. But if you do that, you cut yourself off from the experience of the encounter of the whole with the W in parentheses that opens up the intrinsic motivation. And I think Pascal, and then I'll give it to Mr. Jonkin, basically in emphasizing the choice, that is necessarily bringing the subject into the process of decision-making, right? And this is, of course, as I'm obsessed with Leibniz, and this is basically also, in my opinion, what Leibniz is doing when he says all intelligibility, at the end of the day, will require a judgment. It will require a human assessment. And the way he explains this is in the analysis of citas, as the great Anthony Morley talks about, which I think gets lost with the modality, which the modal thinking that he talks about, which I think actually is hard to understand without the analysis, but I will resist the temptation of that topic. And basically what Leibniz is saying is if you have there is no such thing as sameness in reality. Two apples are not the same or they're just one, right? So there's no equal sign in reality. Well, if there's no equal sign in reality, there's only equivalence, which means there's sameness. But there's only similarity. There's not sameness. But similarity is a mixture of difference and similarity. So when you say these two things are like one another, how are you doing that? Where does the equivalence come from? It has to come from a certain involvement of the subject. And he wants to argue if all intelligibility entails this, then you can't foreclose yourself. You can't enclose yourself in anything. You're in the game. You have to be involved. You have to make a judgment. And I think Pascal is doing a similar thing, which is psychoanalytically relevant, and then I think could be tied to Dante and beauty. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Excellent comments, Mr. Flores. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you, sir. Always a pleasure to speak with you 2 days in a row, sir.
No, it's always a good time. And this is a fun conversation. See, I like when I come to the net and we got very contrary accounts. It's very fun for me because just from my Aristotelian background, it's really fun. One note I want to share what was talked about. I think actually Aristotle's note about in posterior analytic about the circular understanding of nature. So actually this conversation that our accounts of understanding of nature are going to be basically self-loops of failure, because Aristotle makes very clear that efficient and final causation happens at the same time, simultaneously in nature. That's actually a really important detail people forget about Aristotle. So actually, pure physis in study of that alone is not going to, you're not going to be able to capture the real understanding. You're going to keep losing and escaping it. So I find actually Aristotle, as a note from I was talking to Javier about, Aristotle does have notes of basically acknowledgement of negativity based on that point. Another aspect to it is, for example, his major concept from Aristotle in Aegeia, he purposely does not define. And in fact, definition as the formal genus and species combination, the very fact that his deepest concept, the most important one, Aegeia, is not allowed to have definition. The definition of Aegeia cannot be expressed. It has to be only by analogia, basically by witnessing. And he gives his point of, as this is to that, as this is to that. It's the recognition of a person in their nous to see that, to understand. So even though obviously there's a lot of the doctrines and presentations which shared, I have very strong disagreements about. I do think it's fair to point out, one is the failure of definitional form. And Aristotle's very clear about that. It's lacking. It has inherently something's missing from it. Because that's usually the answer, by the way. Like, why are two apples the same? Because they have the same definition. That'd be Aristotle's answer. But it's acknowledging from Aristotle that definition is lacking, because that's not even the full understanding of what the substance is of these entities. It's only the secondary substance, not the primary aspect of it. That's number one. And then number two is that in nature, it's going to, unless you, and that's the thing, actually, want this idea of theology, Aristotle, you have to go into, Aristotle actually is forced by the problem of the circularity of nature to have to answer what is the cause of motion. Because that's technically what agents are. Agents are the things that cause the motion of another. What is the cause of the motion? It's a thing that's motionless. It's kind of lacking motion. And that's all these other attributes. Aristotle is forced to have to come to that statement. He concludes that basically the study of theology is necessary because you cannot account for motion without a prime mover who is outside motion to cause motion. Another reason why I bring this up, or I want to share related to this, and actually it's a larger part, is actually the mystery of life. I say that because Aristotle has I've been talking to Daniel about this for weeks now in my research. So the life is the Aegeia of nous. That is, and then actually, in part of the argumentation is, so, and that's the thing, if that is the actuality of nous, is life, and we see entities have life by motion and movement, Aristotle's kind of forcing these chains of logic to have to explain that basically the philosopher's god of Aristotle is this prime mover of full life in the act of theoria, in this self-awareness, it actually is debated, it usually gets translated self-reflectional thought about God on God. It's like a self-reflectional loop. That's not necessarily the only interpretation of that line from Aristotle. That's one interpretation, and a lot of scholars have that opinion. Reflexivity, basically. But it's the other way to take it is that it's the idea. Best to put this. It's when the fact of the cause of life is something beyond life, and this is one of those signs, and then we see the signs of it in bodies and entities and movement and activity. That leads to then almost a fulfillment of what God needs to do is via the entity, that particular. So this is also an example of I just know about idealism. That's exactly the counterpoint, is the necessity of bodies to have actuality in activity and motion and degrees of participation of being. So that's the counter thrust argument against idealism. is that actually submaterial, and actually another thing definitionally from posterior analytic about matter, another way to talk about it is, there's two notes about that. It's normally said the thing that made out of, that's usually discussed about it. But first of all, even Aristotle notes this, is that there's no prime matter. No one's witnessing prime matter. All matter must be ensouled, informed by something. Because there's a certain arrangement for bronze, for metal, etc., grass, bone, blood. There's the all arrangements. So there's never prime matter just abstractionally existing. But another one very interesting is the antecedent, the consequence and antecedent requirements. That's another definition of matter for Aristotle. It's very interesting. That's a really particular meaning, because that's temporal form. That's a completely just discussion of temporal relationship. So I'm just kind of pointing out, like, Aristotle has all this equipment of presentation that, again, if you just use the typical approach of definitional form, genus, species, differentia, you're going to miss all these points what Aristotle's pointing at. And I think actually a big aspect of it is quality of life. I'm more and more convinced that we actually don't know what life is. And it's just so interesting, because actually the final project of ethics is the good life. But we don't know what life is, actually. We can't really answer that question, now can we? At least in my opinion. So, but again, I really appreciate the conversation. It's got my mind going a lot into this. That's all for me.
Well, I think those are wonderful comments. And, for me, and then if anyone has any, and Mr. Kashir, it is fantastic to see you. I like to talk about, as we've talked about before, the trick of approaching things as definitive, not just as definitions. And it seems as if everything within us wants to stay in the realm of definition, ergo some sort of enclosure, ergo some place where we can practically live as if the map is the territory, even when asked directly, we know better, right? Because that, I think the distinction between practical and technical is one of the key ways that humans self-deceive themselves or engage in ideology preservation or defend their subjectivity. Because if I can say, oh, I know the map isn't the territory, then I can convince myself I'm not living in a way that conflates those things and therefore is shutting out otherness or the possibility of surprise or encounter. While in my practice, I never actually live in such a manner that the map and the territory can be split, right? Or I never put, well, this is why we emphasize encounter and surprise, right? Surprise is the great revelation that your map isn't the territory. When you come upon, as Ivan Illich says, the man on the side of the street, right? You come upon that other that actually then also can disgust you or make you upset. All of this then actually is a revelation that your map isn't the territory, which then can make you, and then this is also why I think basically everything in us can be biased toward planning to avoid preparation, because we want to plan away the surprise versus be prepared for the surprise, which further contributes to living practically as if the map is the territory, even when we're told otherwise. So we are everything within us seems to be in the business of various enclosures. And I would associate, as we talked about, the only way you can know something definitive, the only way that Michelle moves from woman to Michelle is in a continual long-term relationship where you move from a definition to a definitive. And then, of course, the key is that the definitive, oddly, definition is complete, definitive is incomplete. Because the more you get to know someone in their particularity, the more is unveiled to you that they're greater than your knowledge. So you have to relate to them as love. And this is where Cardinal Newman is basically like the only way you get a grammar of assent is through love. Love is epistemological, right? Which, of course, then means love is a temporal form. And then also the key to beauty, as we talked about, is that beauty is strucken from the definitive, right? So you have to move from the definition to the definitive. You have to move from, and then, perhaps in a sense of fallenness, fallenness can be tied to the fact that everything inside of the human being seems to be in the business of keeping us in the definition away from the definitive, in the map away from the territory, and that we have to very much regularly fight that and live in such a manner that we do not do that. And then once that occurs in the experience of the definitive, well, definitive, what's interesting is I think this mystery of what is life, and then I'll give it to Christian, Flores, and then Javier, is that the mystery of life really comes out in the definitive. I think we can numb the edges of the strangeness of what life is by keeping it in the definitional, keeping it under the microscope, and keeping it within a structure that doesn't surprise us. But when you really go, that's alive and I know it. And how do I know it? Because I just apprehended it very suddenly, just like beauty. You just apprehended it very suddenly, this mystery moment of nous. Then you start getting at what seemingly philosophy, theology, and being human are more to be in the business of focusing on. And perhaps the good life has something to do with being able to move in the direction or having a certain skillfulness, a certain courage, to use terms that Christian has put forth, in regard to the definitive, so that it can strike us. And of course, strike is dangerous, but it is also the character of beauty. So I think your comments were very good. And then, of course, the other mystery of the definitive is that as you are attracted from, Michelle moves from woman to Michelle, and there's an attraction and pulling in, there's a movement there, but it is a different movement from causation. It is a movement that is not merely a billiard ball hitting another billiard ball. It's a movement of a depth of appreciation, of seeing, of going into, one could say, a vertical movement versus just a horizontal movement, which then, of course, the question becomes, what makes that kind of movement possible? One could theorize that if there was only billiard balls hitting billiard balls, well, the movement comes from billiard balls. But once you see this vertical movement, that seems to be possible. Well, what is the vertical variable that makes that possible? And then you start positing God. But let me give it to Christian here. Christian, it's a pleasure to see you, sir. And I love your background. It's really cool.
That's the background is my life. It is not a
Yes.
fake one. I'm gonna do something, and then I'll see how I feel about it afterwards. I don't have. I'm a little busy, and then I'll come back and make more personal comments. But right now, I'm gonna just drop a quote it's from Carl Jung's Liber Novus, which I have a copy of but haven't read for. Oh, good Lord. I want to say 15 years, or no, 10 years, 10 years or so. I need to reread it because I think I'll get a lot more out of it second time around. 10 years of thinking, it goes a long way. But here's the quote. You can never deny your knowledge of good and evil to yourself so that you could betray your good in order to live evil. For as soon as you separate good and evil, you recognize them. They are united only in growth. But you grow if you stand still in the greatest doubt, and therefore steadfastness in great doubt is a veritable flower of life. He who cannot bear doubt does not bear himself. Such a one is doubtful, he does not grow, and hence he does not live. Interesting, the word doubtful, the way it's being used here. Anyway, doubt is the sign of the strongest and the weakest. The strong have doubt, but doubt has the weak. Therefore, the weakest is close to the strongest, and if he can say to his doubt, I have you, then he is the strongest. But no one can say yes to his doubt unless he endures wide open chaos, because there are so many among us who can talk about anything, pay heed to what they live. What someone says can be very much or very little, thus examine his life. My speech is neither light nor dark, since it is the speech of someone who is growing. I think this wrestling with the kind of holding or having, as he puts it, of doubt, and the strength required to hold doubt, which I would say could be you call it a form of courage, as at least a precursor for growth, is how I'm tying it into what y'all are talking about in terms of how do we relate to truth and definitions and the weird fuzziness and the map and the territory. What's the fun balancing act of provisionally making claims on how reality is, but being open to changing those claims? And when do we get afraid of like the psychological overwhelm of confronting that the map is just a map, right? But also have that flexibility, fluidity to change it as needed. I think holding doubt and, as he puts it, enduring wide open chaos. But then that maybe speaks to the importance of like containers for doing the work of confronting chaos, right? It's not easy work, right? And some people might have more natural strength for enduring wide open chaos than others. Some might need help. Some might need a special set and setting, which helps to facilitate the enduring of wide open chaos so that they can hold a little doubt and then grow. There we go.
Magnificent, and I'll give it to Flores and Javier. First off, I think that notion of doubt as being a space of growth is actually very important because we often associate doubt as a threat to learning or a threat to knowing, as opposed to the condition of the possibility of actually growth and development. I think also often people may say the opposite of, say, faith is doubt. I think the opposite of faith is fear. And that doubt is precisely the condition in which faith and courage have meaning, right? If one does not feel doubt or trepidation or something, in what grounds, in what terms can we speak of courage and faith and different things? And what that would also suggest, as is a notion we've talked about before, is that one's capacity for knowing or learning is also tied to the particular virtue and character of the person. And there seems to be something about doubt that actually trains one in terms of possibilities of virtue if they can face it and tarry with it, that actually then increases their capacity of receiving, of beauty and understanding, et cetera, so forth. So I think this is very, very important. I think basically Leslie Newbegin basically suggested, he was a missionary, Christian missionary, but he's quite an interesting fellow. He has a book called Proper Confidence. He basically said that certainty and the othering of doubt, making doubt bad, is what actually led to nihilism and destroyed the modern world. Like, because if doubt is bad, seeing as certainty is impossible, you're stuck in the bad and you just go crazy. So he's like, really what we want is confidence, not certainty, confidence. But confidence is a funny word because that's a term of virtue. That's also a term of the subject of working on oneself to be capable of that confidence, which cannot be, which is work, which requires work that cannot be limited simply to a classroom. One must live, I suppose. So that was a tremendous quote. The last thing I'll say is also, to me, on that last point on this notion of, say, needing maps, the question is, what is the relation of the map to the territory? For me, the role of a map is to lead you to the Gödel point, so you get better at it. Like, you need a map to encounter the fact the map. If you never had a map, then, well, you'd be crazy because nothing would be coherent, right? You couldn't ever encounter the fact the map isn't the territory. So you need a map to encounter that trauma, per se. And the map then is there so you can handle it at better degrees, better quality. So you can have high, because I think that constantly brings with it virtue. The map is precisely for the possibility of encountering the real, the fact that it is not the territory, because that then begs a question of you. How will you respond? Are you prepared for this? What will you do? How will you live? Like, once you encounter that, now, in the key word then, of course, becomes you here, because the map has failed. So the map cannot make the decision for you. You must actually make a decision now, and you must reconstitute the question relative to how you would think about it, which, of course, here's the risk of all this. We are now at risk of a massive atomization where everyone comes up with their own map of how to relate to this. And this is why a principle like beauty becomes extremely important at this point, because it makes everyone, because how do you make everyone particular without making them unable to relate to one another? And this is where the movement from the definitional to the definitive, and how that actually has the image we talk about all the time is harmony. And then, of course, in Dante, it is dance, because dance is this form. There's a temporal form, there's a harmony, there's a movement together. And yet there is a particularity and wide open creativity that cannot be predicted ahead of time. It has to be lived and experienced. So there's something about, I think, what Dante shows that is very important. But let me give it to Mr. Flores, please.
That was beautiful. I mean, from the quote that was just read to what the signifier that you keep uttering, which is the map, and how the map is not the territory, but there becomes this sort of, if I hear you right, the conflation between the two. But I really like what also Thomas was talking about with Aristotle, and it shows my Lacanian lack, in which I need to reread Aristotle. But I will say that Lacan was a very avid reader of Aristotle, and the graphs of sexuation are based off of the, I forget the Greek term, but for the Aristotelian logic of the one, the sum, the all, and the not. That's all based off of that. There's also an interesting relation between Aristotle and Hegel. So I had an interesting conversation with he's a Hegel scholar working on his PhD at Villanova. I had an interview with him on why the left should reject Heidegger. He mentioned this point in Hegel and the philosophy of right, which I don't think is actually in the right itself, but on the lectures of the right, in which he talks about the difference between theft and stealing, and the stealing of bread in order to feed one's family who is starving and poor as an act of courage. And he like made a remark saying that like, you know, maybe Hegel advocated for a more Aristotelian ethics than he did the deontology. So yeah, you know, I'll just leave it out there. But I like this notion of, again, Daniel, the map is not the territory. Because one of the things that it makes me think of, and again, I'm going to reiterate this thing with science and Lacan and the signifier, because one of the things that he does like about science, and including physics, is the pseudo-mathematical formalism, and yet it fails at its discourse because when it gets to formalization, that's where sensibility, intuition, etc., fail at grasping truth. And at the same time, there is an imaginary misrecognition between the model and nature itself. Now, the controversy of Lacan is he says that we don't talk about nature itself. Actually, nature in and of itself is indifferent. That's why physics is so fun and we like to do physics. Rather, physics is worried about a discursive nature into which nature discursively is changed as a consequence by effect of a given discourse. And he likens this to energetics and thermodynamics. And this is what was radical for not only science, but also for Freud himself, because there's always this confusion that like Freud biologized the subject or the speaking being or the human. No, he was, his model of the psychic apparatus, the drive and libido was based off entropy and thermodynamics. That something is operating off of a loss, and therefore, and this loss is due to excess energy that just does not work in the system. So we're always trying to maintain a point of homeostasis. This is where his pleasure principle theory comes in. But the thing about energetics, though, and how it relates to the signifier, is that we come to energetic reality or to natural reality by the discourse which creates that object via the subject. The subject emerges from the discourse and splits itself by the thinking subject, which unfortunately remains unconscious, and the other in which it inquires, right? So it's never between subject and object, rather it's between the subject and its representative, which would be that given discourse, to an other, which is not an intersubjective other, but rather that which would hold the field of knowledge together, right? And would thus create the object of inquiry, which unfortunately, because of that, leaves a lot out of the system. Like we see this all the time where certain systems can't account for certain things, and thus it would create a contradiction or inconsistency in one's theory. And what I just described right there is the master's discourse, the infamous master's discourse in Lacan. And that internal deadlock shifts into what he calls the university discourse, in which the theory of knowledge is the driving force of discourse, which doesn't solve anything, but bureaucratizes a market, which would create alienated subjects to, you know, adhere to a master. But before I lose my train of thought, the point is that why energetics relates to that is because of energetics and entropy, we are able to account for the principle of inertia, or no, what is it? It's the opposite. Potential energy. So potential energy is the sort of like constant, if I get it right, versus the kinetic moving energy. And this is what makes the theory of the drive important and the logic of the signifier, because energetics retroactively, through its emergence of understanding energetic reality, could account for the thing entropy or energy as such from its potentiality. And the signifier acts in the same way, and you would be confused to think that what we're getting at with energetics is related to, if we put energetics onto a model of, let's say, a hydroelectric power plant, the sprite of the current, when really we're accounting for this potentiality, which would give rise to the energy which would create a hydroelectric power plant. And that relates to the signifier. It's like we can only account for the emergence of a signifier by way of our model of signification, right? In the same way we can account for any sort of principle of constancy or principle of entropy. The same thing with jouissance and the real. These things are accounted for from the model that is related or analogous to energetics, which is the signifier. That relates back to your thing about the map, is because we create these maps to account for certain things. And like, I like how Zizek talks about this in terms of video games, because there's just certain things in the background, like houses and trees, that remain incomplete and don't have no part of the map, and yet they're still there. There's something real and incomplete about that. And like, it's never enclosed. Like, something could probably add it on into the future. But yeah, like, my point is that like, through the misrecognition of sciences, we always confuse nature for the map, or the map for nature. But it's precisely because of the impossibility of fully formalization, this breakdown, which is ultimately real. And the mathematical part comes up because we get into formalizing that impasse. And so we move from the subject unable to complete that field of knowledge through a new notation of a signifier like S1, S2, Bard A, jouissance, etc. And I think that's so revolutionary in Lacan. And even if he's not a mathematician, these ways in which he's able to like link science and math together, in which why science for him is so important. Not that philosophy sucks, but it's that philosophy doesn't account for its own break. In discourse, there's always certain breaks. And this is why, like, for him, there's a radical break from the old Christian, even medieval and antiquity universal model, or model of the universe, from the Galilean science, which creates a new break and a new model, in which now we could get at different things, because the map in which we're mapping onto the territory is related to a science which is aimed at the literality, to the letter, to the number, in which science epistema today has a relationship not only to theory and praxis, but also techne. And techne could not be without mathematics to create a precise map to account for a reality, right?
Magnificent comments. And I cannot help when I'm given an opportunity to bring up a thinker that I think is extremely important and extremely overlooked, from whom the phrase comes, the map isn't the territory. His name was Alfred Korbowski. He wrote an extremely important book called Science and Sanity. And basically he is writing at the beginning of the 20th century, and he would like to make the argument that there is a certain mind virus, basically, that has not been identified in thought, called identification, ergo the equal sign, that if not caught will cause mental illness and all sorts of problems. And basically what that means is that on these kind of ideas there is a theory of epistemology that then comes to structure the entire discourse. He would have said, yes, it's identification. It's the belief in the possibility that you can identify something. You cannot identify a thing. He talks about the situation. All we can do is situate. There are not things, there are processes, there are unfoldings even. And basically what he's critiquing is the idea of, he's critiquing the idea that when we know something, we know it as a thing. His whole idea is that we are already situating it and participating in that knowledge, and that doesn't mean it is it's not arbitrary, it's not wrong. It is very Vixernian. Yes, Sam. Is that this, and I think Badu actually has overlay here. Korbowski made the mistake of being ahead of his time and writing a really long book he's also in the field of semiotics more with Peirce. He's using that language, which I think perhaps was less able to be received, in the same way that one could argue we have not fully received the fullness of Peirce. We certainly have read his ethics of his beliefs, but the rest of his work is still just gradually being uncovered. But anyway, so basically Korbowski would like to warn that, and one could say it kind of on the point of the early Heidegger versus the later Heidegger, where the early Heidegger is trying to get at being, which you could say is identification, and then the later Heidegger says, no, I really can't. The whole idea that anything can be captured, as Ian Thompson was saying, the whole idea that anything could be captured in the word is a problem. You can't ever really get at the being of a tree. It has to be experienced. So he moves to this, the later Heidegger is on this creating a clearing by which things can come forth. But this is, of course, very, very difficult because we are always already being structured by a discourse. We are always already being thrown into a map. And so we have to, and basically, again, Korobowski is warning that if we don't move from, algebra to geometry, and one could say Lacan is trying to do topography, as many people put forward. Well, that's absolutely what Korobowski is saying. He's saying we will go mad. We will go crazy. We will actually be miserable and eat ourselves. And I think he is correct. And I think basically as well, what ends up happening too is that Korobowski wants to defend the possibility of knowledge in light of the fact that you can never get identification. Because if you can't identify something, what does it mean to know it? Right? Like if all you can do is exist in a situation, what are you getting at? Well, you made the point of nature being quilted by whatever, like human beings, entropy, and different things like that. Once the human being comes into existence, what nature is different than before the human being comes into existence. Obviously, Bard and different people talk about emergent vectors. What after biology comes into existence, physics is known differently. After biology comes, et cetera, and you can never know the thing prior to the emergence, which then is already situating in a discourse differently, right? Well, does that mean we don't know nature? No, we know it relative to a different situation, and our knowledge is incomplete. But here's the key. The question is the function of the word incomplete. Is incomplete mean nothingness or an ever need to relate? An ever need to relate and maintain the situation in the process so that the thing can unfold. Basically, what Korobowski is saying, and then I'll say one thing on the entropy point and give it to Javier, Mr. Jockin, and then Christian, is that Mr. Korobowski is saying is that if we don't introduce basically what a lot of people, Vervaeke and different people are talking about, an epistemology of relation, of continual process, of being embedded in, I cannot help but think of Cardinal Newman, the Catholic theologian, 19th century Grammar of Assent. That's a very important book. A notion of an epistemology that has to ever be participating with, which of course is an epistemology of love, because love moves a definition to a definitive and treats things as an entity in time, not just a point in space. And so if you have a university discourse that is actually moralizing, removing involvement of the subject, could you say, then you necessarily will have an epistemology of points in algebra, which will necessarily cause mental illness and all sorts of trouble, and Korobowski is warning against that. But his book was long. And the last thing I'll say on the entropy point.
Sorry, before you
please.
continue, what is his name? Alfred
Korobowski.
Okay,
Science and Sanity. I think it's out of print. You can get a condensed version. Boy, howdy, he's important. Boy, howdy. He also wrote some other books on humanities. He wrote some lovely texts. He's a tremendous thinker. I've spoken about it before. I think there was a movement of thought that was completely overlooked that I call the modern counter-enlightenment, because I think it's a continuation of Vico, the Scottish. I would put people, Korobowski, Barfield, I can go, Planier, people like this who were completely overlooked, who were warning about this. They're like, hey guys, this is not good. Personal Knowledge by Michel Planier is insanely important about, as a chemist, seeing that the scientific discourse was going to dehumanize everyone. And then it wasn't read or something. But anyway, the modern it wasn't just modernism led to postmodernism, which led to pragmatism. There was another movement of philosophy that I like to call the modern counter-enlightenment, that was in the background developing, that didn't get into the university discourse because it was a critique of the university discourse. Funny how that works. And so it wasn't seen as an alternative. And so we've been ever oscillating between basically postmodernism, modernism, neo-pragmatism, going between all of those, when you actually have another route that I think aligns with much of what Lacan is saying. The last thing I will say on the points of entropy, I think it is also just very interesting with the energetics and different things, like complexity is a result of an acceleration of entropy, interesting enough, where you actually can generate emergence if you have entropy negate itself, right? Where if you do something, a great way to create complexity is to do something inefficiency, which actually then creates a complexity that more efficiently burns up energy. And the question, and what's interesting about that is that would mean, I would really have to elaborate on this, but funny enough, therefore, when human beings do that which is inefficient, that could be the key to creating complexity, such as judgment for oneself as opposed to just giving over to a discourse and letting it think for you. So there's some complexity science that has to be thought here, mouse away, all of those different things. We have a certain doctrine of entropy that doesn't see how entropy in its own negation of the negation, to allude to Hegel, actually gives rise to a complexity by which beauty can come forth. But let me give it to Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera, it's a pleasure to see you today, sir.
Okay, so I have a random question, Daniel. Do you
Please.
think there's do you think there's an Irish Enlightenment going on?
An Irish
Um,
Enlightenment? Oh boy.
yeah. I got names. Desmond, Peter Rollins, Mark Murphy, Richard Kearney.
Hey, man.
I got names.
Shout out to Mark Murphy, my mentor.
Yeah.
Oh, Mr.
Oh,
Murphy?
actually,
Oh, yeah, Murphy's awesome.
Big Sig. I just had my first meeting with Mark Murphy. For spiritual direction. So, we're but actually, this raises a very interesting question, Daniel. So you said that the map isn't the territory. We tried to obscure this, cover this over, but then you said there's like this danger of we know that the map isn't the territory, and I guess I'm trying to frame it in a way that I can relate to it. So I'm gonna put it like this, and maybe you can help me. So if I know that Catholicism as a map isn't the territory, right? What does the negative part of that relating to look like? And what does the approach that you're advocating for look like? So meaning like what does I guess maybe the distinction here is helpful is like what does planning and preparation look like in relation to these two negative things? Is knowing that the map isn't the territory, could it be that I actually just refrain, I don't actually go into Catholicism because I'm like, well, it isn't the territory, so I just don't pick it. I'm curious. So yes, please elaborate for me.
No, that's a tremendous question, Gödel. It's a delight to see you, sir. And very interesting on the idea of an Irish Enlightenment. And like Gerard Mercy is fantastic. And Peter Raleigh, et cetera, so forth. So that's delightful and so on and so forth. Well, so first off, if you don't choose a map, then you can't encounter the visceral reality that is not the territory. Thus, you cannot encounter that trauma. Thus, you cannot have the experiences necessary that can cultivate virtue, courage, et cetera, so forth, so that you meet the conditioning of the beauty striking forth or rising to the occasion of being human, right? If one does not face that, we probably will just outsource our future to some sort of techno Cthulhu or et cetera. So I'm getting better at saying that. I never could say Lovecraft. So that won't be too good. So me personally, one of the things that you can see, so for example, someone who's say a Catholic or a Christian or whatever, there's always the temptation to somehow moralize not interacting with people who think differently than you, right? Because you can say, well, they actually are false, they're heretics, and so it's actually moral for me only to interact with Catholics, right? Or only to interact with Christians, right? If you realize the map is not the territory, then that sort of shutting off automatically being moral or a good thing to do, you cannot do, right? And also, the map isn't the territory means that you need to put yourself in places where you are encountering people who think differently than you. And here's a key characteristic. I really do think, just speaking of Christianity, I think a really important lesson of Christ is that he's seen sitting and with the tax collectors and, sinners, et cetera, so forth, of which he has to bear the weight of being seen with, right? Like if one is in your beliefs and you never let yourself be seen with people who think differently by the people who share your beliefs and therefore will think you're doing something immoral, then you will never develop. And I think that's a very common problem, right? Like one of the reasons people say, and I'll just keep using Christian because you brought that example, like Christians are like, I better never be seen with people who are not Christian or else my family or church or whatever will be upset with me and they'll disown me and I will have to bear that existential anxiety, right? Well, actually, no, you must deal with that because if you don't deal with that, one, I don't think you're doing what Jesus is doing, and then you're just turning Christianity into a closed religion that is pharisaical, right? It is going to be leading back to the idolatry of all of those different things. So I think basically and I think this applies basically to everything because look, what has happened if you were more liberally minded and you tried to enter a conversation with conservatives, you could get canceled, you could lose tenure, you could be humiliated. There are conservative, I mean, now we're seeing, unfortunately, conservative purism arising, where conservatism is now going in the anti-free speech. If you're seen considering liberal ideas, you're blackmailed, you're cut off. I think for me, the first thing I want to say is that if you take seriously the map is not the territory, and that you are in the business of cutting yourself off from the possibility of courage and virtue and development and all of these different things in the very way that you think, then you must perpetually put yourself in the place where you can encounter true otherness, people that think differently, and you can be seen as other by the people that you are regularly in community with, church, family, etc., so forth. If you do not do these things, which are going to emotionally, psychology, spirit, etc., so forth, function as a reminder that the map is not the territory, and actually be a testament that you believe it, then you will actually be shut off from the territory, which would ultimately be like, if you believe in the Holy Spirit, well, the Holy Spirit is changing through history, right? You can't shut down what the Holy Spirit is going to do. The question then becomes, okay, so that would be a practical question on what one does from a position of, say, Catholicism. The question then becomes, why would you choose Catholicism or Islam or atheism or conservatism, et cetera, so forth, right? That gets into many things of the work, of the thinking, of having to make some sort of absolute choice entirely. But also, too, if you understand that every map isn't the territory, then you also understand that whatever choice you make is not going to be complete, and therefore that can both be used to never make a choice or to make a choice and to go into something. But I do think a universal principle of this, and then I'll pass it back or pass it on, et cetera, so forth, is that you must be humble. You absolutely must be humble, because whatever you pick is going to have a certain openness, right? I mean, and I think also, too, just speaking of Catholicism, there is a significant advantage. Like Karl Barth wants to really emphasize the person of Christ, right? Because it's a model. It's not just a premise. Like, what that model means in every age can change, right? There can be a certain shifting, right? Because there's an idea of what would it mean to lay down your life for a friend in 2025 versus 80. There are principles there. And I think what you end up getting at is there's also questions of choosing a model, to be like, or a kind of way of life or a kind of culture for X, Y, or Z reason, and choosing dogmas, choosing particular beliefs, right? There's also those kind of questions. So this opens up a vista, but I'll stop with that. And Mr. Rivera, anything else you want to say, sir?
This, like, it's interesting because it's like me knowing that Catholicism is just a map, not the territory, but then choosing to go into that map. And then I'm sitting with a bunch of people that are ironically radically other than me, which is strange, actually. But then you get this glimpse, like in my own experience, you get this glimpse that's like, well, it sort of underrides my understanding of like what the average Catholic even means, or what the average Catholic even believes, or something like that. And so, yeah, I guess it does set me up to be surprised, actually, in really strange ways. It does set me up to be surprised because I am surprised. I feel like I am surprised every day, every time I sort of interact with them. Because for me, even though I haven't, really come out so extraordinarily other, I have really been surprised how it looks from the inside, and being not knowing that they don't know that I'm other than them. They don't know. But it makes me think, if the kind of courage that you're talking about, would it require me to come out as being radically other, to the point that perhaps I risk, being kicked out of the church or something like that? I guess that would be my final that'd be my final thing.
Oh, there's lots of fun questions in this. But I will note that this is a question, with a lot of the people like Vanderclave, Gödel's been doing the month on the meta, he had Ross and Christian, different people. This is I can never say it, metagetical. These kind of questions have emerged in different things on organization. Please note, this question is relative to any view. Like, if you, there's been periods where if you ask any sort of question about conservatism, you get kicked out of groups or you get alienated or your Thanksgiving sucks. If you say, well, maybe there is something to capitalism. Well, you're a bad guy, you're kicked out. Or you say, well, are we sure that Mary ascended? Well, you're done. You're in huge trouble or different things, right? So I think the first thing I would say, because this is this gets into how does one live in the midst of community in a manner that requires courage versus conformity, but you also have to give yourself over to something without just falling into a mindlessness where you're just giving yourself over to a map so then you don't have to think, and then the banality of evil stuff we talk about in belonging again, right? I would definitely say if you're not even tearing with this question, that's a problem. Like if you're not even tearing with that tension, that's a problem. And then, of course, if there is something about the active need of judgment and discernment continually, that you can never just create consistency and be done, then you have to ever tarry with that tension, right? And ever deal with issue by issue, encounter by encounter, surprise by surprise, which sounds mentally exhausting and very, very difficult. Yes, there is something about the human that is the hard road, as we've talked about and is very important. There is something that has to be regularly tarried with. There may be occasions where you must always be willing to be kicked out of the community. Because if you're not willing to do that and something happens where they're not right, well, then you're not going to stand up and you'll actually be part of the banality of evil. You must always be willing to be seen as other. But then there's also a question of wisdom and discerning when is the right time to unveil radical otherness or to say, I disagree with that position. This is the Beatrice problem of unveiling. You unveil too much too quickly, it can destroy everyone around you, which is not an act of love. But if you stay entirely veiled, then you don't actually give them a chance to see an alternative that might pull them in. Maybe 19 people hate you, but there are 2 people who are actually like, well, what do you mean? But it actually pulls them into a greater spiritual depth, right? So there's a depthness of learning the art of unveiling, the art of when to speak, when not to speak. Oh, but now we're talking about all these skills and stuff. Yeah, that's the issue, is that we've tried to solve the problems of community without skills, simply by creating the right beliefs and just holding to them, right? But now the only way to have community is an age of skills, which is an entirely different sociology. But if we're not able to do this, well, then we're just going to keep falling back into previous models that have their own shortcomings. Much more to say, but those are some thoughts. I'll give it to Jockin and then Christian. Mr. Jockin, please.
I mean, to piggyback on what's been said, I think a big part is the problem when people think it's a map and territory problem is that your doctrines, your creeds are going to be this hard, fast, solve my problems kind of dynamic, right? That's what causes a lot of these problems. We think if we have these doctrines or creeds and we hold fast to them, it solves all our problems. We don't have to think anymore. I think the reality is quite the opposite, and it's kind of what you're hinting at, what Daniel's talking about, is that what you reflected back, Javier, is that really it's an opportunity for surprise. Surprise only makes sense when there's a contrast, and it's by your creed and by that's your measuring stick, because that allows for a difference to show up, and then you become aware of it. And by the way, my experience in this group, in the net, is absolutely that experience. I mean, in the end, who else is a versatilians? I don't think so. Most of the other people here are in other areas of expertise and focus. And by the way, it was me before. Again, any of these other thinkers, modern thinkers, I only have very cursory understanding. I don't have the depth of. I made a choice to emphasize Aristotle and Plato, and up to Aquinas and now Ghazali and things like that. My limit of research has been on those areas. So anything beyond that, I can't. I actually am sitting it's a similar relationship with me, what you're sharing with Javier. I think it also related to that, kind of the building on it. I just kind of draw out the point. Here's a great example. It was brought up before, was the modernist account of substance. And basically the idea that really there's no a major distinction to classical thought is that substance was an internal essence, that there was this kind of soul that was individuated, that had a certain nature to it, that was the source of activity and motion, and then moved forward on its own. And nature and techne were actually uniform. They were the same. That was the classical point of view. Modernist accounts on techne has been the exact opposite. They say there is no internal substance, with progressively increasing degrees of external causation, that it's our imposition into things that express nature, at different degrees. And by the way, in some of these accounts, you have to acknowledge in the legitimacy. For example, fire was a substratum in Aristotle accounts. So earth, wind, fire, things like that. When you go to Faraday with his discussions of the candle and discussion of combustion, we're demonstrating that's one of the best demonstrations of. We have a complete explosion of the substance account, especially on the suboptimum account of substance, which Aristotle has to acknowledges as one of the aspects of substance that's been directly confronted by. That's actually combustion, which is an activity that's not really an entity. See, that's the thing. Now, an entity has now been transformed into an activity, a process, right? And that's an acknowledge, and that's also brings up serious tensions for anyone who's come from that classical point of view. You have to answer these things. You can't ignore it. That's exactly it'd be the same analogy of Javier. You going to talk only with Catholics who agree with the basic creed position. Same point. Now, you can get a richer account if you do engage, if you actually have a kind of openness of account and relationship. I say that because, for example, actually Aristotelian accounts can answer some of these points. One of the major ones is the idea of lack and assumption. What that means is that, for example, things like eclipses, their causation is not necessarily a pure essence of eclipse-ness as an entity, or it's actually interactions of the other things around it. Or basically another language you can use is assumption of waves. So waves don't necessarily are not a substance per se, it's a pattern. Basically, that means that are generated through other interactions. In the case of the Earth, moon relationship creates the sun, creates the wave patterns that cause tides, for example. But so there's a ways you can address it, but it's going to require a very different reading of Aristotle to do that, because that's what I'm getting at. So it creates a much more sophisticated, richer experience if you can process those tensions. I think that's worth talking through, and because especially the biggest problem with the history of thought is, I'll tell this about why my personal interest in going to historical accounts in the past is because the compression of anageia and dumasses to potential and actuality and act and potency, those are definite things, qualities Aristotle does point out, but he says more too. And that's the issue, is that when we do a compression of concepts over the history of thought, that does lead to certain conclusions or certain directions. That if you go back to original thinking about it, you might see there's actually a much wider range, because the whole point was that Aristotle's terms of dumasses and anageia were not definitions in the strict sense. They didn't have univocal meaning. That's the tension about them. Or that's the opportunity right there. And I see actually relationships to Catholicism is actually very similar. I think Catholicism has a lot of richness to it. As a Muslim, I read a lot of Catholic thinkers. I think there's a lot of great richness of opportunity and resources there that you can work with. I think things, for example, the idea of the assumption of the angels, how they work, how they don't have bodies per se, they assume bodies. And that's a very interesting philosophical project to talk through that. Just one example. Or another, as Daniel pointed out, this question of the exemplars. The nature of Jesus, Isa, as this definitional example, definite definition, right? That has this redounding quality of expression over time and space. That's a very interesting artifact to work with from a Christian point of view. I'm not acknowledging that's a Muslim. I'm seeing that from the outside. I see that. So you can point out basically the tensions where there might be creedal tensions you're seeing. But I think it's an opportunity for thought. Just reflecting back to Javier on that. And I can say as a general practice of cultivating of the mind, allowing us to be into spaces of tension like this, or there's surprise, of dissonance, and not is really based on the maturity of not relying on your thought to save you. I think we had a conversation about this like a couple months ago, where in a crisis we just think we think hard enough, we're going to solve our problems. I hate that. That's one it's the great deception of human beings, is that we just think harder, we're going to solve our problems. It's the same mechanism where we think like, oh right, our creeds and our models are going to save us from the crisis in front of our hands, and that's almost never the case. That's all I got.
No, that's magnificent. And but what's so interesting too is that what is a community preparing you for the crisis as opposed to a community giving you the right beliefs or the right in crowd, right? There's this different way, so there's also other things, like if you join a church or you join a community or you join republicanism. These are not all the same, but there's some sort of being willing to be seen as, That's also a lot of it. What should you be willing to be seen as, right? Because that will impact how people treat you, et cetera, so forth, right? Then there's a way of looking at that. Well, I've got to find an organization that shares all the same beliefs I have, which in a way gets into the problem of you're looking for a coherence that equals a correspondence, like that corresponds with you, which we were saying at the beginning, that's a problematic undertaking, which perhaps you could argue in the past where maybe thought was not as unfolded as it has through time and encountering otherness and difference and pluralism and all that different stuff. Maybe it was more likely that you could find something that created the impression that correspondence equals coherence. One of the great gifts of global pluralism is it becomes more difficult to believe that coherence equals correspondence, that the map equals the territory, precisely because you're encountering otherness on the internet. You're being more so forced to encounter that, wow, we just have been enclosing ourselves forever, haven't we? Oh, man. And you can't unsee it, as Nabokov says. Once you see it, you can't unsee what you've seen, right? In one way, this is a great curse because it overwhelms the psychology, it's leading to all of these psychological problems. And one of the things like freaking Korbosky was getting at is like, hey, as the world interconnects, if we're still trying to use identification in an interconnected world and we don't have geometrical situational reasoning, which ultimately is topography, we're going to kill each other. We're just going to kill each other because we can't make space for otherness, because 2 + 2 equals 2 and 3 doesn't exist. And you have to get rid of everything alternative, right? And so that is showing up. And now you're basically at the age where you can no longer deny that people are different. If you do, you have to go to more extreme avenues. You have to become more extremist, more closed-minded, and that's what you're seeing. That's why you have this increase of extremism. It's not what is called extremism is actually a kind of logical, rational response, because it's like the only effective way in an age where it is basically very difficult not to see that otherness is there, right? Well, given this, and Michael, good to see you, sir, and I'll give it to Chris. Given this, we have to rethink what exactly is it that a community, or what exactly are we asking if we ask the question, should I join the Catholic Church? Should I join? Like, what is the question even getting at? In the past, it could have been like, do you share the doctrines? But if we now know that the map isn't the territory, coherence doesn't equal correspondence, what is the question even asking? If that makes sense of what I'm getting at. What are we even asking when we ask that question? Because you could say, well, it's a bad question. You shouldn't ask it at all. You shouldn't join anything. You shouldn't put yourself into anything. Well, that leads to problems, right? People aren't interacting. You don't have community, atomization. Everyone ends up in their own little enclosed bubble. And then, all the problems that come with that, right? Because the psychosis is enclosures that people are in, right? So that just multiplies like crazy, right? And choosing something to put yourself under, to let have authority over you, seems necessary for that. But then, of course, the question becomes, what is the thing that you're putting authority over you? Is it the church, or the beauty to which the church points? Is it the ideas of the political position, or the possibilities that it could afford, right? And is that a cheap move, or is that a real move? Is that a justified move, or is that just a quaint, cute move that you make to leave openness so you don't have to listen to everything, right? These questions open up, but let me give it to Christian, then I'll give it to Mr. Flores. Christian, please.
Oh, boy. This is, I feel guilty here, because I was spent the last 3 days writing this big post with you. Little context for me: I never went to college. I never formally studied philosophy. So now that I I've always been a philosophically minded person and think a whole lot. And then I'm like, oh yeah, other people thought about all this shit too a long time ago. But now that I've gotten really into writing long form essays and research, it's kind of like self-directed higher level education, where I'm like, ooh, I'm just going to spend 3 hours reading this, 10 hours reading that, blah blah blah. So it's pretty fun. And now we're talking about stuff I read a lot, and the reason I feel guilty is because I have a lot of stuff to say, and I was. One thing I love about this group is that it's like I'm on my toes and I don't know what to say, and I'm like forced to like engage in a deep way. And the idea that I'm like, ooh, I could say this, 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 and this, and this. I'm like, it's cheap. It's cheap. I remember the host of Mystery Science Theater 3000 saying like the reason we love talking about the past all the time is because we know what to say. We're very comfortable because it's just like, oh, you know, because then you don't have to risk looking so foolish, right? Um, I know this, and this is a very easy, comfortable way to carry on a conversation. So I feel like, should I say all these things that I have to say? Well, fuck it, I'm just gonna do it anyways because it's fun. Um, so one thing I'll read off the top here. I was looking at the Tao Te Ching for this essay, and chapter 71 is titled "Knowledge Sickness." Interesting title. And one thing that you won't get from my translation of it here is like the kind of almost mathematical symmetry in the way this chapter is written, where it's just like the same three words reorganized, and it's like it's kind of beautiful in its poetry, and that kind of gets lost in the need to like make it make sense to a Western reader, or really even just like kind of extract the meaning out of it a little bit, because I think it's purposely like playfully short and pithy, and like and it's like a little bit of a wink there. But anyways, um, so there's the idea of wu ji, which is like wu wei, not acting, but not knowing. Ji is knowledge. Wu is like kind of the absence of something. Uh, and so there's like the characters are knowledge, and then non-knowledge is strength. But the way I'm going to read it is knowing ignorance is strength. And then you flip the characters around, and the second line of this couplet is ignorant knowledge is sickness. And you could interpret it slightly different ways, but you know, it's a kind of a core concept. It's the Socratic creed of I know that I do not know, the others do not know that, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, it goes on. It's just these three couplets. So knowing ignorance is strength. Ignorant knowledge is sickness. Once sick of sickness, then no longer sick. Wise people are not sick because they are sick of sickness. It's just like, here's like 10 words organized in a like really pithy way to like convey this like kind of deep concept, which I love. And I never would have known that if I hadn't like done the work of looking at the original Chinese ideographs and doing a little etymologic work there. And then you're like, ooh, this is like nicer than I ever could have known if I just read even a really good translation. So, I mean, all right, so that's like maybe a nice little starter into this idea of like the map is not the territory, right? I mean, if you know you are ignorant, then you are strong. If you know the map is not the territory, that's strength. If you believe that the map is the territory, ignorant knowledge, well, then you're in a position of weakness. And once sick of sickness, well, if you're paying attention, you'll notice that believing that the map is the territory leads to problems, right? You're like, oh, I like ran into an unexpected obstacle. This, you know, the logic didn't flow out the way I thought it was. And now I'm stuck in quicksand or at a dead end. And if once you get sick of that, that forces the function of no longer wanting those outcomes, right? If you're paying attention, I mean, there's some threshold, I guess, and some capacity for learning from your mistakes, and some intrinsic motivation to like not make mistakes anymore that is not necessarily universal, because some people just make the same mistakes over and over again. But it's saying like that's kind of the thing that forces wisdom, is making a bunch of mistakes. So you have to be like really courageous in like being ready to say, fuck, I messed up, I misapprehended, I misprojected what was going to happen here. So then going to logic systems and like the Aristotle's identification, right? Like A equals A, and or I guess this one is more like the excluded middle. Something is either true or false, and I'm not a scholar of Aristotle, so I am like, you know, dipping my toes into deep waters here. So forgive me if I fuck up. and correct me as well, Thomas. But that, it's kind of interesting that only like somewhat recently, in the last 100 and some years or so, like in formal mathematics, we have three value logic, or n value logic, which says there's something besides true and false. And I mean, I first heard of that from Robert Anton Wilson's maybe logic, which he wrongly attributes to John von Neumann. It was actually like 19, where's my notes here? 1920, from a fella by the name of a Polish logician. I'll probably say this wrong, Lukasiewicz, something like this. Pretty respected logician who said, hey, maybe there's like something besides true and false. And he might have called it undefined. Some people call it maybe, whatever. But then interestingly, a decade before that, there was unpublished notes of Charles Sanders Peirce, who's also a mathematician, or if I'm saying that name right, and a logistician or logician, anyways, who had come to the same conclusion. We must have a third value here, but he never published it. In the notes that were found after his death, he says triadic logic is universally true, but then later in his notes, he says all of this is mighty close to nonsense, which is interesting, and maybe speaks to his like unwillingness to share like that work that he did publicly. But it's true. Like it's like when you exclude the excluded middle, or when you open that middle up, it's like it can kind of feel a little nonsensical because you're not sure how to orient yourself, right? It's like I'm in open waters all of a sudden. Whereas the binary logic, or like dyadic logic feels a little bit more safe. I know I'm either on this or that side of a line. I'm not in some weird gray zone which I don't understand, and which is like kind of basically infinite. So that was interesting. But then the Wikipedia page on three value logic doesn't even mention the Jaina system of logic from India, the Jain philosophy, which has a 7-value system of logic, which I find interesting here. Arguably, it is that something exists. That's one. Arguably, it does not exist. Arguably exists. Arguably, it does not exist. Maybe, I don't know. Arguably, it is non-assertable. Someone mentioned that before, like that like, can we even assert whether it could exist or not? Arguably exists, arguably it's non-assertable, arguably it doesn't exist, arguably it is non-assertable, arguably it exists, or it doesn't exist, or it's non-assertable. And not only do they have the 3-value logic that they matrix into the 7-value logic, but it's always the preface of arguably, right? They're not even saying like it does or doesn't. It's like you can make a case for these values, not ever a final claim per se. So that's interesting. That's like 500 BCE. And then I think like this. So this is more the identification side of things, like the equal sign. And I hadn't had this thought before, but it came to me while y'all were talking. So like that problem of is, and how one thing can never equal another thing. Let me like just kind of work my way through my thoughts here. It's like I want to say that it has something to do with space, right? Like the once you have an equal sign, you have a relationality, and that automatically implies a distinctiveness, right? There's like the thing on this side of the equal sign and the thing on that side of the equal sign. And I think it's the same problem that idealism runs into as a kind of totalizing philosophy, like the consciousness first perspective. Because if it's all the one first, this kind of like unified consciousness, how does it become the many, right? How do you start getting equal signs? Or how does it like reflect upon itself in order to like multiply in some whatever? I don't know. I've never heard like an explanation of how the one becomes the many. Um, so, but I think it's like it's similar to the identity problem. But I need to think about it more to like say that in a succinct way. But there's something there. I'll get back to that later. Um, so then to bring it into the question of ethics that was brought up, like I think it's the same thing when we ask the question like, what is the good life, right? We have a problem of identity, and we also have a problem of maps and territory and all of that. Uh, and lately, I've been thinking, like on the one hand, there's the problem of what people call moral relativism, which is like, well, we can't solve this ultimate problem, so we just have to accept everybody's whatever version of what the good is. But I think that, like, first of all, people don't actually make that argument very often. Um, it's usually just like employed once in a while in like political debates, but like in practice, nobody lives by that, right? no one, no one fucking is saying, "Oh well, yeah." I mean, if you think it's okay to take all of my stored grain from my whatever, like yeah, I mean, what can I say? I can't stop you. That's your moral. No, no one actually lives by that. But what I do think you can make an argument for is like I'm calling subjective ethics, which is just basically the same concept of our ethical intuitions are subjective. There is a kind of intuitive mapping system that we create that tells us this is good, that is bad. And you can't really get around that. Even if you think you agree with someone, even if you have a congregation of Catholics or whatever, and we're all signed on to the same creed, well, we all interpret that creed differently. We would all, interpret in context differently. So, like, I don't agree if anyone ever makes this argument that like there is no such thing as subjective ethics, or that's like a faulty foundation for like collectively exploring what the good life is. No, I think that's like you can't get around that. Um, and then the question just becomes, as you said, like how skillfully do you engage with that reality that we all have our own ethical mapping, so to speak. And I just gave a talk the other day. It was pretty fun to my local alternative builder communities out here. We had a conference, and mostly we were talking about alternative building and sustainable shit. And I decided to talk about politics, which was I'm talking to people who are like a lot of people who want to live off grid and like fuck politics and like get off my back with your regulations and all this stuff. So it was like a dicey choice, but it went over pretty well. I tried to make it pretty fun. But one of the things I talked about that I hope landed is the when we have to talk with each other about a difference of values and decision making, where do we like get hung up? And I like identified a bunch of places, and that's like your tribe. How are other people? How do the people around me feel about it? Tradition, ideology, taste feels yucky, feels delicious, whatever. And how like we'll like go that far in our contemplation and then stop. And then, of course, we're not going to have a great conversation about how to proceed if we're arguing from the level of like unexamined, whatever, dedication to tribe or bias toward just like what feels yummy, right? And I think you at least have to move to outcomes, which is like, if we do X, what do we think Y will be? Like, and we might disagree about what Y will be, and we might disagree about what we think Y should be. I mean, we might disagree about what we want the outcome to be, but we can at least, I think it's just like a simple thing is like, let's just talk about what the outcome will be and keep grounding the conversation there. And then we're less likely to get caught in the quicksand of all these like half-formed arguments. And then at least if we talk about outcomes, we also are in a place where we understand each other's values better and each other's reasoning, right? You're like, oh, well, you want that value because you have some like deep religious belief about it. I want this value, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's probably like an intractable problem. Let's look at some other outcomes where we might agree and like put that to the side. Or, let's look for the overlap of what you want and what I want and work towards that. And then maybe we can have a more productive conversation. Uh, and I think it's hmm. You mentioned, Daniel, like the radical unveiling of otherness and the role there, which I'll say a little bit too, because I think this is important. This speaks to courage for sure, speaks to sense of tribe, like just a deep sense of instinctual, evolutionary survival. No one wants to go into the out group. Um, it's one thing I'm like kind of never worried about with this group, which I love. But I'll share like a quick personal story, then I'll wrap it up. I think I've gone for a long time. Um, I have a group I've been a part of locally here for 3 years, and people I love, and it's been going beautifully. I brag, maybe I jinxed myself by bragging about it, that it's like, check this out. We have this group of people with diverse cultural, political, social backgrounds, people in their politics and backgrounds and whatnot, without a bunch of rules or hierarchy or really like a whole lot shared other than like, let's like do cool shit, help each other build homes, etc. And then a few months ago, someone in the group who kind of like, there's always like de facto leadership roles, people who are willing to set up and help with just like the basic logistics of organizing. And they started doing what seemed to me like some weird power grabs and like typical narcissistic behavior. And I was like, oh, fuck, 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 fuck. What do I do here? And I like spent 2 weeks thinking about it, and then unfortunately decided I had to do the thing where I put my like well I voluntarily exited the group after like making some statements, and I won't go into like all the reasoning of like why I chose this particular strategy, uh but it was hard, man, because like those are my friends, and I don't want to stop seeing my friends. I don't want to like, and I don't want to risk my friends maybe not agreeing with my choice here and losing friends potentially. But in the like my own little equation there, I thought this is what I got to do. Um, and in the end, it worked out. It's working out. It kind of solved the problem I wanted it to solve. Almost all of my friendships are still intact, and I feel good about the future. But it's so true, man. Like that's I think it's probably one of the hardest things to do, and I hope no one ever has to do it, is like, are you going to risk making yourself an outsider in order to preserve the inside that you care about? Or in other terms, like to preserve your own integrity, right? Like, oh, you guys are fucked up, I got to get out of here. That's a situation as well. But yeah, and I think it speaks to this point that we can't just philosophize, right? I mean, it takes a toll on your nervous system to do stuff like that. So that skillfulness that you're talking about in community, um, it's like a full stack of skills, right? It's the ability to like think and strategize well, to express yourself well, to deal with the emotional impacts, to whether that's in person or just by yourself. And um, that's where I like, when I think about the future, I see like this big potential for cultural evolution is like a well organized and very accessible learning of those skills, and understood in the context for the purposes that those skills serve. Not just like, ooh, you'll be more productive at your job if you can be like less stressed out. Like, no, it's like we as a culture need these skills, which means culture needs to start thinking about culture. Um, anyway, thank you. for your
Magnificent.
time.
Absolutely magnificent. What you just said there at the end is exactly right. If we don't have these skills, then we have to have something do our community for us or do our relationships for us. You can use the economy, you can use religion, you can use politics. It becomes a mediating factor, and we can put a certain something between us and the other person, right? Well, if you say, well, capital enslaves us, politics is corrupt, religions can be problematic, then you're talking about more the face in that kind of Levinas way, encountering the person. But you see, it's not like people say, well, we need to love one another. Well, how do you do that? It's not self-evident what love means, right? There's skills, there's ability. Well, we need to be kind to one another. Well, how do you do that? Like, the problem is we'll often drop in words here like, but, we need to appreciate difference and empathy and love. The problem is every single one of those words, even if they're valid, do not tell you what they mean. And what are the skills behind them? And what are the discernments that you need to move? And that's also, well, actually, to the question, the more you move to the definitive, the more you have to see the word love entailing particular decisions, particular skills, particular situations that you then have to think, right? And that radical increase of skillfulness in the skills of being human seem absolutely, if one wants to talk about some sort of sublation or movement of a new social order or a new way of socializing, it is going to need to require this kind of skills. They're going to require that ability of humans to make those sort of decisions. But you see, that can be intellectually exhausting. And so you'd rather have a bureaucracy or some sort of consistency provided by the religion or the politics or the ideology or whatever do your decisions for you, right? Because decisions are hard. The lack of mediation, which is an increase of individual freedom and possibility, is existentially exhausting. Therefore, we outsource it. But if we outsource it, the thing to which we outsource it could structure the discourse or control us or manipulate us or lead us to a techno-Cthulhu or something, as Mr. Downs has been speaking on, right? Well, if we don't want that, then we have to get better at making the social based on the human. Which then the question is, what are the skills of that? And how do you learn those things? Well, I think, hopes of spaces like this and encountering, you don't know who's going to be there, the surprise, what's going to be said, what the topic's going to be. There's a certain liveness there. Also, is it possible to have people with different accounts and beliefs actually orbit and kind of learn? And also, too, we all think we're better at handling otherness before the crisis than we actually are. And if you don't have that regular training beyond which you probably think you need, then the likelihood of that going well is quite low, or the ability of having the fortitude to stand for what needs to be done and making a decision like you did, Christian, or standing in, say, the Catholic Church or being in that place of vulnerability, the likelihood of actually having that fortitude is quite low without that regular sort of training. It becomes very difficult. But then I think this is what's interesting. For me, when we get into philosophy as it's supposed to be, it has something to do with thinking these problems and actually working on the kind of flexibility of mind and way of personhood to actually be able to work through and to situate yourself in these kind of ways of social interaction. But it becomes very difficult. And I think also you asked, and then I'll give it to Mr. Flores, Mr. Jock, and Javier, and Sam. I think also, too, on the idea of subjective ethics, I think that's correct. I like to talk about conditionalism, which moves us beyond the subjective and the objective. Like, there's conditions that we have to judge and discern by which the ethical is then apparent, but it becomes much more architectural. It becomes much more design-based. It becomes much more, what are the conditions of the situation? And if the conditions are X versus Y, what may emerge from it? And there's a certain conditionalism that becomes very important. And good to see you, Michelle, as always. And so conditionalism becomes extremely important. I think also you're pointing at something very important. If we identify there's a problem with the word is, then the question, what is the good life? What is ethical? What is the human? Automatically has to shift if we take that very seriously. And I love everything also you shared on sick of sick, ignorance, the Indian, like, yeah, the manifest, it's not just true, false, there's also manifestation is a key category in just how they understand time and history and different things, and the Ramayana, Upanishads, et cetera. So forth is extremely important because also manifestation is a very valid category if the map isn't the territory, because the map had to have manifested, didn't it? And is the map true or false? It works because it's false. Like, that's the key. Like, Box tells us all models are wrong, but some are useful. It is the fact the map is wrong that means you can use it. So wrongness is actually the very condition of the map to make it possibly pointing to the true. So if we have true and false as opposites of one another, and we do not also have a category of something manifesting from the territory that makes the territory intelligible, or maybe intelligible, we could be misreading it, then we're actually missing steps in how thinking operates. So I think that was very well put. But for me, and then I'll give it to Mr. Flores, on the idea of like, we can't really ask what is the good life. There seems to be good conditioning, good skillfulness, good action, good flow, good going with it, good improvisation, good readiness, good preparation. Like these seem to be what we are getting at on the question of what is the good life? How do you make good music? How are you ready for those situations? There is no one and done, this is the good life. There is a certain readiness, a certain preparation that is able to, almost as a kind of martial arts, take whatever life throws at you and figure out how to make a decision in it so that the beautiful can come forth. But exactly, what is the ethical? Well, there is no is. There is a mode of being, which gets into things like habits and virtue and et cetera, so forth, that Aristotle stresses, that the good life is dependent on one's training in those skills and having the courage for those things. The good life is not given, but it is not impossible. It is incomplete, but that's why it can be intrinsically motivating. It's just a question of how we condition ourselves to that possibility. Many beautiful things were said, Christian. I will give it to Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was amazing, Christian. And yeah, like myself, I am not a formally trained philosopher, so don't feel bad of what you said and what you think that you lack. Not all of us could be, smart and sophisticated and and suave like Javier, and army strong. No, but for real, there was I was gonna touch on a lot of things, especially because you brought up the Tao Te Ching. I'm a Catholic by practice, but I'm a weird Catholic because I do have a weird aversion towards the church, and that's because of my political praxis. But at the same time, my spiritual practice as a Catholic integrates Taoist meditation as well, and especially since I practice Tai Chi and Tai Chi Chuan, which would be the martial arts applications of it as well. And Wu Chi is something that we practice daily when we practice Wu Wei, which is through the meditation. But I think from the way that the conversation shifted, that my point of the conversation will be at. And after that, I have to go because my girlfriend is going to pick me up because she just got out of work. But about community, ethics, politics, etc., and where does this quilt? At the end of the day, philosophically, besides my psychoanalytic background, I am a Kantian. But I'm a weird Kantian because Daniel, I don't know if you know this person, but I will give you some gems if you haven't to look him up. He's a Japanese philosopher who is a Kantian named Kojin Karatani. And he wrote this work called The Trans Critique. And it is a play on Kant and Marx. And he has this very controversial take to say that Kantian ethics cannot work in capitalism because capitalism treats people and things as means to an end. And people are ends. Friendship and love are ends. And in love and marriages are mutual agreements to, sacrifice one another for another. And Karatani says that, in this series of essays in that text, a bunch of criticisms towards the anti-Kantian turn, many critics of Kant, and even says that it is actually the thing in itself which is active, and the subject in Kant, which is passive. That the thing in itself is the prime mover, which draws us to knowledge. And of course, as he says in the beginning of the first critique, we start with, knowledge, of course, starts with our experience, but it doesn't end there, nor does it encapsulate all of our experiences. And then he goes, of course, with the aesthetic, the transcendental aesthetic, the deduction, etc. But he says that Kant was working on the entire process of his critique throughout, all ends. And in the final critique, the noumena is not just this thing that's outside of phenomena. The noumena is actually the limits of reason. But why it's the limits of reason is because the noumena has everything to do with the other. What can I know about the other? And what does the other have to do with me insofar as that I live in a society where it's not just about me, but also the other, which kind of gives rise to his theory of the cosmopolitan. Now, Karatani writes another work after that, is still aligned with his Kantian Marxist affinity, called The Structure of World History. where no matter what, and again, this goes back to think of the map as not the territory, but you could see his sort of topology or topography of history as structure, as a sort of map, as a condition of possibility in the Kantian sense to help us out with what's going on. We are social beings, and the elementary form of our sociality is what he calls mode A. So he goes off of these modes as an affinity, but also a criticism of Marxism because it focuses on this idea of base and superstructure, but thinks that the superstructure is important because this is where ideology and all this stuff happens. We got to look at the base, and that the superstructure is an extension of the base. The base can be seen as different modes. The elementary form of a base, which is of a human society, is what he calls mode A, and that is the gift exchange. We just exchange stuff no matter what. We are always exchanging, whether it be collective or between you and myself. And that could either bring peace or it could bring turmoil to another person or to another clan or another kinsmanship. Of course, this is being drawn from Mauss and Levi-Strauss, etc. But no matter what, we cannot escape exchange A. Now, these aren't teleological, linear, or from a stages perspective. These still exist even today. What represses stage A or mode A is mode of exchange B, which deals with the social contract and the state, where the state will oppress gift exchange and demand sovereignty and obedience for the sake of having peace and protection. You are afraid of your neighbor? Well, you can give up your rights to me and I will grant you peace and security so long as you see me as a sovereign rule, whether it's one person or it's a bureaucracy. Then we have exchange C, which is commodity exchange. This is what we see in capitalism. And the fact is that commodities existed back then, even in Greek slave society. But commodity exchange is the dominant one today, and that produces crisis. What D is the return of the repressed. D is the return of the repressed of A in its higher form, which is communal life, and which represents the kingdom of ends for Kant, and something to see as temporal, always creating a rupture, right? And I think this is something that we're seeing today, not only in reality and politics and social life, but also in philosophy, in which we're trying to see new ways of living, new ways of acknowledging the other, new ways of seeing love, new ways of seeing advancement in knowledge and sciences. And I think we can't do that without understanding this map, which is also the conditions of possibility, which is constantly coming in forms of the return of the repressed, of mode A, of what we're exchanging with one another, right?
No, I think Cortana is extremely important. And at the end, he also is like, hey, you think Hobbes is bad? Kant's, kingdom of ends is very Hobbesian because it either has to occur, there has to be some sort of way to get a mode of exchange D that he has as an X, or else we're just going to keep falling back until we do, and eventually the system will eat itself. His next book, as Mr. Michelle Bowens tells me, is on the topic of spirits, which we can associate as cultural spirits. And what are the cultural spirits? The conditions of which make people actually receptive of mode D. I think also Alan Frisk, as kind of going through the different ways, the forms of social relation is also quite a fascinating book. Good to see you, Mr. Flores. And so really, basically, we have never figured out how to have societies at scale that are able to engage in mode D, a new mode of exchange. And I think Koatani is also correct that Marx makes a mistake to place the political in the superstructure versus the base, because the political does not dissolve if you free people from the modes of exchange, or the modes of production, I'm sorry. The political just stays. So the political, in Marx, the notion is that modes of exchange, certain readings of Marx would say that the modes of exchange will naturally shift as you have a transformation of the base, because the superstructure of which orients those exchange can dissolve, basically. And so you will have, as Patron would say, would be the dictatorship of the proletariat, where people can name. But basically, that's getting at the problem we're pointing at. Because what you're saying is, can people go back to exchanging and interacting with one another, basically face to face? Gift economy, people have no problem with gift exchanges in families, or even fellow Christians or fellow Hindu, people like them. Oh, you're a Republican, I'm a Republican. Oh, great, let's come over for dinner, right? We can deal with this as long as we don't have pluralism. as long as we don't have difference. If you're introducing global pluralism, difference, and all of these different things, you have a radical problem. And the argument could be that perhaps Kant is putting forth a categorical imperative as overcoming difference, because if there's a certain ethical absolute that is going to apply regardless difference, well, then perhaps they could bring people together. And then that gets, I guess, as was alluded to, the theory of judgment and moving the noumenon to the limits of reason, which obviously Hegel does as well. But ultimately, I do think the question, this is where the economists come in, and this is where I would speak to Kant, is that the economists say, is this an adequate theory of human motivation? Are people motivated by the good? Well, they are when it's pleasurable and when they enjoy it. But are they motivated by the good simply because it's rational or you see necessary? Well, you say it's not. You say, well, okay, if we don't learn to do motive exchange D, we're all going to die. That would be bad. Therefore, it's rational to figure out how to get along. That's not how people work, unfortunately. Even if that was true, even if we will all kill ourselves if we don't figure this out, that alone will not compel us to change. This is where things like beauty, intrinsic motivation, et cetera, so forth become extremely necessary, because basically knowing we're all going to die if we don't figure that out, usually in my opinion, what destroys community is what I call the dreaded drift, the drift. And what I mean by the drift is something happens in a community and then they just kind of show up a little less. They come on Monday, but not on Tuesday. They used to talk, they just kind of drift away. There's never a declaration of I'm leaving. A dramatic declaration usually isn't what occurs, but people get hurt or they get tired or they're anxious. There's an energy that's not there, and there's just kind of a drifting. The motivation goes away. That tends to be the fate, and it especially will be the fate without beauty and a doctrine of forgiveness. More can be said, but let me give it to Mr. Jockin, Javier, and then Sam. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, my only note just to show, I want to just add is this common discussion about Aristotle's excluded middle principle, right? That's very true for syllogisms. That's where this comes up exactly in that part. That's very true. There is, but there in the Aristotelian corpus, there's a lot of other points, though. For example, the prayer is said is one of those things that are statements that do not have truth or false. That's one example. Rhetoric, in terms of persuasional presentation, that's very much necessarily operating on the same logic of excluded middle. A syllogism would be used for. I think most importantly is analogical reasoning. And I say that because analogical reasoning is very interesting, because like explicitly from Aristotle, it is the mean between univocity and equivocity. So, and you can use that in reasoning. There's a very special posterior analytic has a section about it. It's very short. It's actually not that explicitly described that much. It's sat next to a tension that you cannot use metaphors in definitions. So you're not permitted to use definitions, metaphors and definitions. However, the next section is about, however, he says there are cases of analogical association, reason of unity, and you can reason with this. So it's just interesting, because that's actually one of the questions in Aristotelian thought, is this mode of analogical reasoning. There's hints of it in there, but it's not necessarily systematically presented. The closest we can get to it is some notes about the nature of induction from Aristotle, which are borrowed from, you can actually use the Parmenides dialogue from Plato to kind of point that out, meaning the entity in itself, how it acts upon, is acted upon, and then how it acts, and then the other in of itself, how the other has been acted upon, and how the other acts relative to the observational account. That's the best outline, because it's basically from this Aristotle points out that you can draw out analogical associations, because out of a great abundance of many, from the plentitude of the magnitude of experience, there's a kind of generation out of that from memory to draw out a commonality. Aristotle's example is actually the understanding of rest and motion from observing different physical phenomena, oceans versus bodies, etc., like that. Another example is actually it's in morphology, the biological structure of squids to fish to humans to vertebrates, and there's no common name for that, for the structural skeleton, the spine, basically. So you have to use a analogical concept to talk about it, and it's via function. And that's the point. Function is an analogical concept. because we use it all the time. We're transparent to realize what we're doing there. If we say it's the same function, that's a kind of bindingness together of things that are actually can be very different. And I say that because examples like to move, to save, and we see this in examples like in digital space is a pleth with this kind of mode of thinking. We just forgotten about that. We just take it for granted for now. Which is always the case with analogical and metaphorical terms, is that they always start as very novel and very surprising, and then they fade into mundane givenness. It's always this kind of receding back into the background quality about it. But that's my point, and that's the point. These analogical terms have this strike of middleness, and kind of sitting between truth and falsity when they're first appearing, and then when they get used and they're found to be functionally effective, and in the discourse that they're being applied to, they actually are receding back into the background of a kind of given concept or understanding. That's from Aristotle's accounts on that. That's all I have to add. I just want to share that with what I discussed before.
No, I think that is spot on, and it pains me to say it, but Mr. Korbowski, I think, does downplay analogy in Aristotle. He is screaming against metaphysics and any very more materialistic in his thinking, and he really wants us to he wants to establish a new form of logic that is going to be based on semiotics, like person and different people like that, but the tools right in front of you of analogy. And then, of course, Hofstadter and Sander and different people, like analogy actually is fundamentally geometrical, situational, non-algebraic, and forces you to always move in your thoughts. Well, Korbowski, that's what he's after, and this would have been a path. His explanation is, I think, radically prophetic and profound, but the address is not adequate, is how I would put it, even so, but it pains me to say it. I will pass it to Mr. Javier Rivera and then Sam. Mr. Rivera, please.
I really like the way Chris frames it, and then Thomas bringing up this analogical reasoning, because it makes me think about the idea that I brought up between Jock and you and me and Luber. But now I'm thinking, like, is it possible? And I want to say, I think Jochen is saying it's possible. And so is Chris. Is it possible to be ethical connoisseurs? Right? Because the reason why I'm thinking about this is that is the system set up in such a way, and it probably is, right? That we don't afford ourselves to taste and compare, kind of like when you're trying out a bunch of beers. Because I feel like what happens is you have some people that just like Bud Light and they say, well, it's the best beer I've ever had. Well, unless you're a beer connoisseur, you kind of have no idea what are the possibilities of what beer can actually taste like until you've gone through all the varieties of the taste that you could consume. So if you want to talk about dark beers and what is good, well, it seems like we run into this categorical error where we say, well, dark beers are better than light beers. It's like, okay, but before we get there, which one's the best dark beer? Right? Like before we get there, which is the best dark beer? So that means we have to discuss the dark beers in relation to other dark beers, which I feel is analogical reasoning, to be able to get to some standard in which you determine what is a good dark beer. And then we can discuss and compare light beers and dark beers together, and what are the standards in which differentiate them and make them completely other than themselves with these other tasting. Because what I always tend to hear, and it's kind of funny, like when you talk about like subjectivity, because it just shows how when we label subjectivity always wants a kind of distance between actually going deeper into its primal interest versus not. So subjectivity will say rock music is bad, right? I like country music instead. But the problem is that's just a categorical difference. You're not really going into what exactly constitutes the standard in which determines good rock music. So that means the person, what are they using when they say rock music is bad? Well, for some reason, I would have to talk to the guy that's obsessed with rock music to even get close to what that standard is, in relation to even justify my claim that rock music is bad in relation to country music, right? Like, so it seems like only people that are obsessed with rock music would be able to determine, with some variety of means, to say that this rock music is lacking in corresponding to the other possibilities that I've experienced. So there's a way in which it's so strange that subjectivity can go so deep into itself that it comes out other than itself as to almost portray this real objectivity to things. And then you can really understand in a strange way, you know, like even when someone's like fascinated by like types of wood, like why is it that they would know the types of wood that is like so good, you know? But then they can talk with other experts and then they can look at each other and be like, you know what? I actually understand your logic for the wood that you use in building things. I actually understand it. Even though I disagree with you, I understand it. So it's fascinating to me the depth in which subjectivity can enter in its art, in its craft, in its interest, and sort of bring up not merely like a subjective standard, so to speak. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, I think that notion of the connoisseur is very, very interesting. Well, so there's a few things, and then I'll pass it. There's an issue where as you become more, in a sense, qualified or more in a position where you can know if something is good or bad, you become more limited in your application because you can only apply it to beer, right? But this is a problem because that would mean as you approach the particular, you lose the universal. And there's a massive problem on how do we deal with the universal particular problem regarding politics, economics, et cetera, so forth, right? Because if you lose the universal, then we have a bunch of atomized, separated people who cannot talk with one another or relate with one another, right? Well, our hope would have to be that it is actually in the particular, the more you particularize, there's a way for things to become particular that makes them then definitive. And there is something in the definitive that is universal. That's our hope. If it is the case, and I'll give it to Jockin, if it is the case that there is no universal reality, I suppose, that can possibly come out in the particular, we seem doomed because all you could ever do is shrink, wait for the day when there's a misunderstanding between the particular groups, especially a moral disagreement, and you'll go back to a civil war. You'll respond to that with a re-centralization that will take you back to the problems of totalitarianism, into response to which there will eventually be another decentralization over and over again without ever swinging between those pendulums, without ever dealing with the problem of centralization versus decentralization, universality versus particularity. So this is where the notion of beauty and seemingly philosophy and analogy are all very important. Because if a particular thing can become a definitive thing, which in its definitiveness is beautiful, and if every possible thing at a certain relation of particularity turns it into a definitiveness that then creates beauty, this becomes a common basis that sublates, that includes the particular in the universal versus be that which you choose between. And it only seems to be beauty by which this can be done, because beauty seems to be encountered the more definitive something is. The more woman becomes Michelle, the more it becomes beautiful. So, you know, so the more definitive it becomes, and thus creates motivation. And also, seemingly the encounter with the definitive also perhaps teaches a way of thinking that almost can function as a universal language across differences, because you know how to talk about things different from you, because that is somehow afforded to you by the experience of the definitive. One could argue that that is what philosophy is, or theology, etc., when it is done well. It is learning a certain language that is able to speak across difference while honoring difference and not losing it, right? Analogy also becomes very important, because analogy lets you talk between things that are different, that honors that in their very difference finds a likeness. That's the key. The more particular a thing is that you describe well, the more it points beyond itself. Well, that means, so in a funny way, this would suggest the problem between the universal and the particular is that we haven't been particular enough. We haven't related to the particular enough. Sam, always a pleasure. Thank you for being here. And you could argue to what Mr. Flores was saying, it's because we brought the wrong epistemology to the particular. We have brought a, I suppose, scientific discourse to the particular, to break it down into parts, to see it as material, to see it as smaller material. But I've referenced Cardinal Newman, because Newman's grammar of assent is basically a movement of epistemology to higher forms, and you start with object that you identify, you know, pen, to move to Shakespeare's sonnet that you know is beautiful but you can't explain it, which teaches you it's possible to know something without understanding it. Then you learn how to move in a intuition that you don't fully articulate till you articulate it. Then you move that from Shakespeare's sonnet back to the pen and go, what if this is more like the sonnet than it is materiality? Oh, what if people are like that? And there's a grammar of assent. There's a logic of epistemological that eventually, for Mr. Newman, brings you to, of course, beauty. Because, you know, and beauty, of course, is fascinating because it is, and so ultimately epistemology is impossible without love, because love is an epistemology. And beauty is that of which you ever love, that you can never exhaust in that love. And so what has basically occurred is we're stuck with certain problems in politics, like between the universal and the particular, because we're bringing to the particular in epistemology of, I'll just say, science, when the only way to turn the particular into the definitive is with an epistemology of love, which requires training certain virtues and forms of the subject to have that experience, which we don't believe in because we think the only ethical system is that of utilitarianism, which would actually then just change the particular not into the definitive, but into the utility, of which conceals totally the possibility by which it can strike us with beauty, at which point it then becomes impossible to think in terms of addressing the contradiction between the universal and the particular. I and other everything becomes unaddressable. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin and then Christian. Mr. Jockin.
Bill, what you're saying, Daniel, but Javier, what you're saying too. The whole point of that subjectivity becoming something other than subjectivity, just on the example of connoisseurship, is the idea of, for example, actually related, it actually helps draw out this idea of goodness versus beauty. I'll tell you why. Because that goodness is analogical. That's the thing too. Even that, but here's the difference. When you get a bunch of people experiencing and giving their assessments, let's say they're doing a like-it score. So on the degree of goodness or likeness, I like this beer, right? It's going to be a distribution of that. You know what's objectively the case? There's going to be a central tendency. Certain beers are going to be better than others by central tendency. If you get a large enough sample of people experiencing this beer, that's real, that essential tendency, which is from subjective preferences. That's all that is, especially when you're unqualifying what goodness is. Because that's Aristotle's famous critique of this whole problem of the idea of the good. If it's univocity, then we have a problem, because then you know what you had to explain the different kinds of goodness. And especially when it's assuming that you don't have to qualify it, but you do. because goodness in beer is under very particular domains. And also, even that question of what makes a beer good, this condition that relates to phronesis, practical wisdom, because what's, a stout is excellent in the winter, but in a hot summer day, a light ale is actually better. As an example, there's a kind of, and actually relates to architecture too, which Sam was here to talk with me, because you heard that, but that's the whole point, is that architecture works the same way. The climate, the environment, time, temperature, even things actually in a food, especially, is memory. Memory and food have a very strong correlation. There's certain memories and ideas and associations and cultures attached to certain foods that affect the assessment of goodness for that food or that drink, or in this case. So all those, those will show up as a central tendency of a distribution. But see, that's a meaning presentation, right? A mean presentation. That's different from beauty. Beauty, yeah, exactly. Mom cooked exactly. It's called in cooking. That's called the X factor, right? This kind of memory association. That's why some people actually really love peanut butter and jelly from like Skippy and whatnot, like better than homemade peanut butter and jelly, because exactly that same point. Or even an example like why people have, even though McDonald's has objectively not high quality burgers, like the burgers are not high quality, but because people have associations of family or growing up and that changes the association. Like that's the value exchange or the goodness of that hamburger from McDonald's. It's not about the actual particular taste of it. It's the memory association with it. But beyond that, that caught me off guard. I saw that, I want to addendum that detail on the kind of instability of goodness as a category, because, and especially if you treat it as a universal strategy, it's really analogical because it does have a central tendency, property, in distributions when people experience it. But beauty is not the mean; it's the exemplar edge of a whole new category, right? That I've seen many times. What happens is, at one point IPAs didn't exist. Different kinds of beers just did not exist as a category. It wasn't even conceived of. And then it was revealed, and then became a whole category. And that moment, I make the argument that that's a moment of beauty when there's a whole shocking new category presented, which then just like analogies and metaphors, they subsume and basically go into the background into a category of goodness, because now you have a new category of assessment of. And that's the thing too. Also, it becomes a kind of unit, right? Isn't that kind of interesting too? It becomes a mode of comparison and evaluation, because units are the way we use are required for measurement. And an exemplar is actually is a definitive unit, which then others can be compared to and associated with. These are the qualities of the beauty of an experience of beauty. Gives you that assessment or capacity to do that. But just to kind of draw out this kind of ethical connoisseurship. And by the way, this is talking about temperance. Temperance is the safeguarding of phronesis, and it's the beginning of wisdom. Actually, Plato has a dialogue, Parmenides, where he says that basically, what's the science of science? What's the science of science, right? They justify it. It's temperance. It's fascinating. It's meaning that, so thus the actually memory, and actually it ties actually was said before about that quote, but that sickness of sickness is the beginning of wisdom. That's a relationship to temperance. You have to have memory to know, oh right, when I do these things, I don't feel good. This is, that's a negative state presentation of staying away. It's certainly pointing you out that you're not at the best. Because I always like Plato's definition of temperance as the informed the pain to desire the best. I've always liked that because it kind of points to this relationship. And that's basically the idea of ethical connoisseurship, via the experience of things that get you pleasure and pain. You find by memory certain things have way more beneficial long-term than negative. And you build memory from that. And that's really kind of builds a connoisseurship, basically, a kind of understanding of that when particular things occur, there's associations that come with that. And then you basically build wisdom from that. Yeah, so that's what I have. Wheels.
So Jackin, I just want like a clarification question. So okay, so if I were to stick with my beer analogy, which is ironic, the good would simply be going deeper into the dark beer mean, like what constitutes a good dark beer, But then when we start discussing different kinds of beer, like dark beer between light beer, are you saying that that leaves potential to discover a different category of beer within, I don't know, two experts on dark and light? Um, I don't know if that's an opening, because I feel like maybe that opening is there, but it doesn't seem like the opening is there within just dark beer itself. Like it has to be within a higher level of analogy versus just dark beer itself, where the opening can possibly exist, where they start discussing the differences and they're like, wait a second, there's something not quite right with the dichotomy between dark beer and light beer. And are
Well,
we bridging something new here in this discussion?
nice. Well, that's what you're getting. Well, two notes, right? There's one is this. What my point was that there is a difference of moment when the category of light beer has been revealed, and now there's a whole experience around that measurement, around that unit of assessment. That's different than the first revelation about light beer being a possibility, being actualized. That's a subtle difference, because, but a very important one, because again, once the unit comes to exist or comes revealed and then becomes a whole account from that, now you're in a discourse of two goods now associating with each other. I'm just saying that's how I would play this out. Now, hypothetically, in the discourse between the light beer and dark beer, probably things like what I just pointed out, this idea of climate having an effect on the goodness of the entity, that's revealed through the discourse, because you realize that certain beers are better in certain contexts than other contexts. And that doesn't dismiss that this is arbitrary. No, it's actually quite consistent. You know that there's a tendency that in colder weathers and snowy climates, etc., things, the qualities of a dark beer, of a stout, will do better, will be more fitting to this environment and this context than a light beer versus a hot summer day at the beach. A light ale would do better there. So actually, talking through that, you get to see, yes, there would be this kind of higher concept revealed through the discourse, right? In that case, it's a climate. Climate is a factor for products like food. That food is affected by its climate, which people don't realize. People don't, unless you're studying culinary, you don't realize that. That's a factor that would affect your assessment of goodness or fittingness or appropriateness of a food in a certain context. And actually, that relates to Plato's comments in Greater Hippias about, basically, for example, what is the fitting material for an instrument? If you say Greater Hippias makes the point, gold. So that's a univocal statement. In all cases, gold is beautiful, and more important, the most beautiful material. All things should be set in gold. That to be the thing that which is added, which gives beauty to all things, is gold. Then Plato gives the comment, oh, so you want your ladle to be gold. But then the problem is, gold ladles are conducted to heat. So you can't, when you try to grab the ladle, as opposed to being wood, in a very comical presentation, Plato's presenting that you spilled all your soup now at the party. So that's actually a demonstration of the quality of fittingness, appropriateness that a discourse about goodness will bring up. It's going to reveal those things. But that's a different conversation than the revelation of a new category of beer, as an example, just to draw up the distinction.
Wonderful. And I'll give it to Christian. And if anyone has final things to say, on that, there's always that idea in Hegel that thought has to pass over into otherness to know itself. And so there's this weird way in which if you're asking about the beer, then there's a beer that can, like let's say beer, then you say, oh, there's a light beer, dark beer. Oh, so then you start defining in that. It's like, well, how do I determine what's best? And you can't do it just between the beers. So then you move to otherness of the situation and the environment and judge it relative to that. And one could argue that what thought does in making a decision or a assessment is it moves to as far as it can before there's too much to think, and it's saturated in a kind of Ebert way, and then it goes back to the point. actually. So it moves to the environment. Let's think about how many factors can we think for this decision, and when do we get to the point where we can't think anymore? Okay, then we go back. So finitude, the very limitation of thought, is actually kind of a grace that allows you to make the decision. Otherwise, you could always expand into new variables, and you could go on and you could say, well, there's Pluto, trying to make your decision about, the beer, or talking about atomic structure. So then thought has to move, and so thought has to move in order to understand. But because there is a limit, because there is finitude, that understanding can eventually decide. But only because you as a subject can recognize the finitude. You've hit the limit of what you can think. You can't think anymore. You can't go beyond that factor. Or you say, I have enough factors, right? But there's a judgment there. There's a discernment. There's either the subject that is saturated, they've gone to the limit of thought and can't think any more factors, or they say, I have enough factors, and they stop, right? So the subject has to be part of the decision making, which then, of course, you're pointing out the metaxis, Desmond, the between of the beers. Well, there actually is, of course, a between even when you're just asking about dark beer, because it's you and the dark beer. So you have you and the dark beer, there's a metaxis. Then there's a between. Then when you bring in the light beer, there's the between. Now there's three, but now there's a triangle. There's three. And once you get three, then you have a grammar of ascent. You can move to a one. And then what you do is you tend to move to the environment. You gather enough to the finite point of the point, and then you go back down to the 3 points and rethink them relative to what you gathered them up in, which is going to be a reflection of your finitude. And this is how thought works. This is what Korobowski is getting at when he talks about the situation. We have to think situationally. But then the question becomes, what is ethics then? And I'll give it to Krisha. I would just say some people will make distinctions between morality and ethics. Morality, perhaps we can say, is in and out. What do you need to do to be Christian? And what is it to be out of Christianhood? Where ethics is about between Christianity and atheism, Christianity and capitalism. Like ethics is about the between space. And it is therefore about what one needs to do to be prepared for the between space, ready for the situations, ready for the surprise. And connoisseurs in the ethical, as opposed to, say, connoisseurs in the moral, would be individuals who are trained to handle the between. And what does it mean to be capable in the between, as opposed to simply capable of identifying in versus out, right? And I think we are basically, if we hold that distinction, I'm not saying we have to, but if we hold that distinction, we're basically in an age where we now have to somehow think the social in terms of the ethical, not just the moral. Because basically most of human history has the social has been organized by the moral. Mr. Jockin, good to see you, and I have to run in a little bit myself. Society has been operated according to the moral, and the ethical was done by economics, or the ethical was done by politicians. Like you had trade routes or salt or trade agreements, or law did the ethical for you. Because you would just set up what is the legal global framework, and that's how you dealt with difference, right? We basically handled the ethical through institutions primarily. I'm not saying there are no examples of ethical, but where there was ethical, it was, it obviously did not scale. It was more unique. And honestly, the betweens were more not so between, like between Methodists and Baptists, or Baptists and Presbyterian. There was between, but not radical between, I suppose, right? I guess if this is so, using this language, we could say where we are now facing the problem of the possibility of the social according to radical ethics, not just, shallow ethics or outsourced ethics, but according to radical ethics, a radical encounter of the between. Perhaps there's a better way to word it. That's a way that I'm thinking it. Never have we figured out, arguably a lack of education, institution, etc. Never have we figured out the social according to the radical ethical. We've never done it. You could argue we now must do it. But let me give it to Christian. Christian.
We must.
We must. Categorical, radically ethical imperative. So,
Indeed. We are sick of sickness.
I love that phrase.
Must become wise. Yeah, I'll keep it shorter so we can all get on to the next things in our days. I've got things too, and man, the time flies when we're having fun. So I'll stick because it's fun with this like beer question and good. I'll try to stick. Well, or maybe I won't try to stick. We'll see. But it like when it comes to the question of taste, which in some sense is a question of beauty, right? As much as it's a question of good, right? You know, what's the good beer? Well, I don't know. What's the more beautiful experience of drinking a beer? They're kind of like very much connected questions. And I think that's always across the board with beauty, truth, and goodness is that we judge one of those in how much affordance it gives us to the other two. Um, so anyway, something is more true if it allows us to more access to more beauty and more goodness or more truth as well, right? Oh, this is like a new insight that makes me understand more truth, whatever, right? But you know, the thing that I've come to, and I'm probably just finding maybe new words to say stuff that people have been saying forever, but it comes back to that is thing and the problem of the is, right? When we say this is good, I think that's often where we get into problems and trying to talk with each other about what's good, right? Well, that is good. No, that is the best. No, that is the way. And I think for me, the way I've solved it is I use the word sense. My sense of good, my sense of beauty, my sense of truth here. So there's that way of talking about it, which implies the subjectivity of my ethics, for instance, um, but also allows it, I think makes it easier to then inquire into how I've come to that sense, right? Because it's like, well, what is the metaxis here? There's something inside me that's relating to whatever it is. Well, what is that? Now I'm investigating my interiority, and now I might be in a better position to change my sense of what is good, or to express my sense of what is good to you, and then maybe you'll change yours. At the very least, we might understand each other better. But again, when we understand it as a metaxis, if I'm using that word correctly, I'm just kind of picking up on it. Um, then we're like looking. We have a domain to think within or explore where our sensibilities can change. And then we might come to agreements over a radical divide, right, in our ethics and be able to build a bridge or build commonality. And so I think that's the building a kind of vocabulary of how to talk about the good, the true, and the beautiful, I think is probably a big part of what's needed to solve this problem, which we must solve. It's just this, and it's funny to think that maybe even like a simple little change in our grammar could facilitate that. Well, let's do E prime, right? Let's get rid of the word is. Let's try to talk about this without even invoking the verb to be, and then see where that forces us in expressing ourselves. Well, okay, I can't say that is good. Well, what can I say about it then? Well, it makes me feel good. It tastes good or something like this, right? And then we're already like having a much more broad and expansive conversation with a lot more inquiry. And I will I'll end here on the idea of appreciation, where I've never done well with like what they call the gratitude practice. I'm just list all the things I'm grateful for. I'm like, I don't. It just never did anything for me as like a positive psychology deal. But then later, I developed an appreciation practice, and that I found great. What do I appreciate about that? Oh, and then I'm like enriching my positive affect towards something. And I think that can be a really good way to help people or help ourselves become connoisseurs of X domain. It's not, well, I want to know what the best is, so I'm going to become a connoisseur, because that question of the best puts you in the framework of like judging and comparing, and then you have expectations and you're subject to your own preconceived notions of what makes something the best. But if you take the approach of appreciation, that's a whole different thing. Then you're like, oh, this is a new thing. I'm curious. There's some eros here. I want to know what it's like to experience this. I want to know why it is uniquely good, not better in its goodness or lesser in its goodness, but the thing of it in itself. And that's a big part of the Wu Ji concept that I brought up. The not knowing is the not instantly appealing to something in terms of class or category, but just to know it as itself. I promise I'll end here. It also ties into the Taoist notion of Wu Yu, which is to love something not because it serves some purpose that you get to like keep getting the value from it, but because it is ephemeral, because it is unique, because it is transient, right? When your kid takes their first steps, right? You don't want to like make your kid forget how to walk so you can relive that moment over and over again. Well, that was a good moment, so I need more moments of him learning to take his first steps. No, it's part of why it's good is because it's singular, right? It is unique. It's never going to happen again. This one moment. That is Wu Yu, is loving things because they'll never happen again, because there's nothing else like them. You can't replicate them. You can't capture them. And then if we take that and kind of make that how we relate to life in general, and like, ooh, an opportunity to love, to enjoy the experience of loving something because of its uniqueness, rather than it's kind of, value ranking or something like that, then maybe we get into a place where, I'm interested in exploring your ethical system because I want the experience of loving things the way you love them. Oh, this is important to you. Why? Oh, because you have this love for whatever it is that's motivating your ethics here. You love to see your kids be healthy, whatever it is. I have now an opportunity to expand my experience of love by understanding yours, and then we're coming closer together and figuring out what the hell we should do.
Magnificent. I'm gonna remember that example of kid. I need you not to walk again so I can relove it. That was fan-freaking-tastic, and I love this idea of appreciation practice because there's something very important where you are training your capacity to receive a thing, right? You're kind of getting yourself out of the way as well, right? Which makes me think of this Heideggerian clearing. And so there's a few things, and then I will have to run. Alas, this has been too much fun. So thank you for your time. So I wish Mr. Luber was here because I will speak of Heidegger for a moment because you said a key idea. If we could get rid of is from our language, what would that do? Would that alone be enough? That would change everything. Well, Mr. Korobowski thought so. He's basically the father of what Eric Brohm with Holochain, as I talked to VoiceCraft with, is talking about grammatology, which is the idea that if you have a problem you can't solve, then ask what is the grammar by which you are solving the problem, because that might be the problem. So the example Korobowski gives that I use all the time is he says, if we still use Roman numerals, if we never created the grammar of, Arabic numbers, numerology, etc., you could literally not do modern physics. Modern physics literally is impossible with Roman numerals. It would take too much energy, it'd be too confusing, you couldn't do anything. That literally the ability to think things is tied to the symbols you use, or the grammar, he just talks about symbols more so, but grammatology is that. And what Korobowski is warning is that our ability to think is always already symbolized. It is already figured in a grammar, which if you encounter a problem you cannot solve, it could be that the reason you can't solve it is because the grammar itself does not afford the possibility of thinking the problem. And I think Mr. Korobowski is correct, that actually we are using a way of speaking, perhaps Heideggerian chit-chat or algebra or whatever. We are using ways of relating to problems of which by that in of that being the symbolic make the problem unthinkable, right? So if we're asking how do we make different worldviews relate, and we are using a symbolic of isness, there is no way to make them relate. They will kill each other because one of them is and the others are not. And so the debate is which is and which aren't. And everyone, of course, thinks theirs is in a transcendent sense and the others are not. So you have to use a different language. So if I were to give my story of Heidegger, how I interpret Heidegger, his life story, is Heidegger actually is, and all Heideggerian scholars are free to deconstruct this as much as possible, because I think Heidegger's own intellectual journey is a coming to realize something like this problem. Because when he starts off saying, we forgot being, well, the truth of the matter is it wasn't that Western philosophy, which is what he's mostly focusing on, forgot being. They realized that the problem of being had to be moved to God because that was all being could be, because being had to be ultimately transcended or else it was reduced to isness. So it's not that they forgot the problem of being. In a way, they solved the problem of being and moved on. It's just that Heidegger then went, well, in a atheistic, non-religious worldview that is after science, this answer does not suffice. And it seems like what you've done is forgotten the problem of being. But really what happened is it was a realization in Western philosophy that being could not be addressed other than as that which could not be brought into isness, that had to have been the ground and cause of all things, because isness has to come from that which is not reducible to isness, and a word for that is God. Now, one may not like using the word God, but that's how they used it, so it wasn't a mistake, it logically followed. Heidegger actually realizes that being cannot be thought. That's ultimately what occurs, because that's why he doesn't finish being in time, and ultimately the closest he gets is in the metaphysics, but concerning the question of metaphysics, and ultimately he goes, no, being is not something that we can think, it has to present itself. It has to come forth. So the later Heidegger is all about clearing and conditions of intelligibility and making designs. And this is where he comes to love Japanese philosophy with the Kyoto school, because they were all on this with annihilation and everything. And he comes to see that. And also, what else does Heidegger do? He gets into friggin' poetry because he realizes we have a symbolic that makes the problem unthinkable. And he's looking for ways to break language to open up what's behind it. This is exactly what Korobowski is saying and doing. And where Korobowski is doing it in the realm of semiotics, Heidegger is doing it in the realm of metaphysics, but they all converge, in my opinion, that the problem is the symbolic itself. Because Heidegger is trying to have new approaches to phenomenon so they come forth. He talks about clearing, country paths, different modes, letting. What is letting other than clearing? Letting is an epistemology of love. That's ultimately what it is. When you love something, you let it be itself, right? So Heidegger's like, we need an epistemology of love that he calls annihilation, letting things come forth, which Korobowski is saying, our very symbolic does not let things let. There is no letting in our symbolic, in our grammars. Things can't be let be. But when you made the example so well that if I say, my sense of the good, this is key. Because if I say Christianity gives me my sense of the good, versus I say Christianity is good. When I say it is good, I'm saying the atheist is not allowed to be, actually, are they? I'm cutting out their letting. But when I say that Christianity gives me my sense of the good, I sense Christianity is good, well, then I let there be difference. In that very linguistical change, there is letting that is also annihilating my certainty, but not nihilistically. I'm annihilating certainty to create a shared ground or clearing in which we could relate in a manner that doesn't fall into totalitarianism and violence. Because what does isness necessarily lead into? Isness is a word for total. And what is total but totalitarianism and authority? So and then the other point Korobowski is getting at is it's not only the word is that has isness. Almost every word we use signifies isness, like cat, like building. Everything suggests things are stagnant. But of course you go, well, Korobowski, are you saying that we should talk about catting and buildinging and inging and inging and inging? He's like, basically, yes. And you're like, there's no way we could create a new language of verbs without nouns, which is ultimately what this is pointing at, without bordering on nonsense. And Korobowski would say, well, if we don't risk bordering on nonsense, then we're going to have mental illness and totalitarianism. So I take that risk. Heidegger comes along and says, well, what if poetry is a nice middle? you're not having to talk about catting, but you're also using language to make itself more fluid. And what if people were trained more so in the arts and things like poetry that would change the relationship to language even when they're using it outside of poetry, which even if you use the word cat, would always in your subconscious have a certain reminder that it's not a noun, it's a process. And is not Bergson and Whitehead and all of the thinkers that that people like that are talking about, Matt Segal, is it not process, relations? All of this is moving into it. But here's the key insight. Korobosky is basically saying, because we are language animals, you can talk about processes all day, but if you don't change your relationship to languages, process is actually not a verb, it's practically a noun. So you have to change the entire way by which you relate with people. The question on what do I mean by definitive, that's very, very fair. So definitive means definite. So a definition would be woman, say, etc., whatever your definition of woman is. Definitive is where a woman becomes Michelle, like my wife. Definitive is the only person that will ever be that person. And definitive, though, is different in the way I'm using it from particular. Because when I pick up this cup, it's a particular cup. It's not a universal cup. But really, that's of no significance to me. It becomes a definitive cup when I say this was my grandmother's favorite. Oh, now it's definitive and I have a relation to it. So the particular then becomes different. It becomes deeper. Definitive is a deeper particular. And also, the trick to the definitive is it's infinite. Because there's a story behind it. There's a metaphysical dimension. My grandmother's favorite. There is something that is not captured in the finitude that can be related to and deepened, right? So the trick is to make particular things definitive. Because it's not enough simply to treat them as particular. You must treat them as definitive, which is only possible by love and also training yourself to approach things differently. And Korobosky is saying we will never do that without a different language. Yes, and poetry expresses this. So, belonging again, belonging again 2-2 on the problem of scale is obsessed with the problem of language. Because basically it's saying if we don't use language differently, inspired by Korobosky and all these people, then we can't begin to deal with the problem of spreading a different mode of subjectivity that isn't going to ultimately just lead into totalitarianism. One of the things that to me I think is unique about philosophy is I do believe philosophical dialogue changes your relationship to language just like poetry does. It does create a certain fluidity of language, and you treat words as we do it all the time. We bring in different terms, someone else just naturally brings in another, you're mixing them. Philosophical dialogue is not definition. It is very fluid, it is very alive, and people at the drop of a pen will bring up, like I just defined a new term, definitive. And now you know it. I just did that right there, right? You apprehended it. Yeah. Now the thing unlocks. So there's this fluidity to the language. Philosophy is able to train the subjectivity that doesn't fall into the pitfalls of isness and is able to let being come forth as beauty, because that's also what the classical people understood, is ultimately being was beauty. And that's where you have to end up. And it's not that they forgot the problem of being. They saw that the being led to beauty and God and all of that. It wasn't a forgetting. It was a addressing. It's done. Basically, they're like, well, that's the address. Now we just have to live in a way to make it come forth. What they forgot to do, this is what my opinion is. What they forgot to do is how to let being come forth. It's not that they forgot being. They realized it was God and beauty. They forgot how to make people experience beauty. That's what they forgot. And that's because what did the churches do? They became, well, more Protestant in a bad way. Less art, less aesthetics, less choir, less poetry. They became more about dogmas. The religions forgot how to make being shine. Not that they forgot being, they changed the design architecture, the sermon became dominant versus the prayer. They lost the practices of being as beauty, which of course made the effect seem that they never thought beauty at all, or being at all, because how could you have thought the problem of being and then forgotten how to do it, right? It was a reasonable supposition. Well, that's because the only way to maintain beauty is fleeting, evanescent, non-systematic. You have to remember it like Plato's Meno, and it's hard and requires virtue. It's very easy to forget the conditions of the possibility of being because they demand so effing much of you, and we have no idea how to scale them across difference, thus making it seem as if being was lost when really what was lost is our willingness to do what was required so that beauty can come forth. And that's what we're returning. And I think Heidegger basically realizes this. His life story is a process of Heidegger's life is the story of Western philosophy. That's what I'm saying. He starts off saying that Western philosophy forgot the question of being, and he himself is isomorphic of the trajectory of Western philosophy. He in his entire life, you can actually get the trajectory of philosophy all in one place. Just following Heidegger from beginning to end is like reading all of Western philosophy. And I think Heidegger's life is therefore useful precisely because he very well articulates where we are now, and it's the problem of language, grammatology, symbolics, and clearing. And so the question is the following. What are the communities like, and how do we make the communities so that isness doesn't show up? That our relationship to language stays fluid, and we are able to address problems and approach problems politically, economically, socially, etc., so forth, that is not captured by our grammatology, that is not captured by our symbols. This will require philosophy, this will require art, it will require encounters and surprises by difference, it will encounter relating to otherness, because all of this makes you treat language that sounds like isness, but your relationship to it is different, that keeps it in the realm of process and clearing and openness. And that is what I think we are doing in spaces like this. That, I think, is what is possible in the online social coordination mechanism. This is also why I don't think it is by chance that so many of these spaces online that you're seeing are using philosophy, because there's an intuition that this mode of speech frees you from the tyranny of isness. And it's not that you're all getting together and saying, let's do philosophy because it's best. There is a certain sense of a new way of speaking is required that is most at hand in philosophy or art. People are also doing creatives. There's and religion. These online groups are going to what? Religion. So the three categories that Hegel pointed out, religion, art, they're at hand. So those are what people discuss. But the essence of why you're even reaching for these things is an intuition of the problem of the grammatology itself. A problem of the isness itself. You're trying to figure out and how to talk to change your relation to symbolics, because if you cannot do that and you've encountered problems that your symbolic won't let you address, then you're doomed unless you change your relation to the symbolics, and these things at hand best afford that, and train your subconscious to do it without you consciously thinking about it, because it also has to move to habits. It has to move to where you don't think it anymore. Your relation to language changes without you thinking about it. That's when you've done it. That's when you've created the condition of possibility, when a new relationship to language becomes subconscious. Now you have the mode of subjectivity that can move into opening these new possibilities, but it also has the design architectural problem of how do other people come into it? How do we show and model virtuously these new grammar, and how do we not lose people along the way? And those are the questions of praxis that are now afforded. But the problem of the grammatology is absolutely at the essence of this. And that is what we have to think and address. I've enjoyed it.
I've definitively loved this conversation and you guys. And I think music yes, is the way we do this.
That was for Plato. No. I should have included that. Music is absolutely central. And what's very interesting is that conversation that avoids isness is experienced like music. You naturally experience a certain musicality to language, just like in poetry, just like in art. There's a musicality that comes out in a language that doesn't fall into isness. And I don't think that's by chance. And I don't think it's by chance that people associate music with eternity, that Plato talks about music, that music is precisely a mode in which difference is one in the music, dance, and so on and so forth. And basically, we are in the age where language and our symbolic and grammatology must move from definition toward music. And the more it can be like music, the more it will afford us the symbolic needed to think our problems, which if we don't have, we can think about the problems all day long, and we'll be like modern physicists trying to address their problems using Roman numerals. It's been a treat. We love you too, Christian. Thank you so much. Javier Rivera. Thank you, sir. I've enjoyed it immensely. All the best to you, sir.